Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The fluorescent lights in the basement hummed their familiar tune, casting their sickly green pallor across the concrete walls as I made my rounds. 23 years I'd been walking these corridors, checking boilers, replacing filters, ensuring the mechanical heart of Meridian Heights kept beating. I knew every pipe, every wire, every corner of this place, which is why the footprints shouldn't have been there. They appeared just past the main electrical room, muddy impressions leading toward the south wall where nothing but storage lockers should have been. The prints were fresh, still damp against the cold concrete, and they belonged to work boots. The same size as mine, I noticed, with an uncomfortable chill. I followed them with my flashlight, its beam dancing across the familiar territory that suddenly felt foreign. The footprints led to a door I'd never seen before. I stopped, my breath catching in the stale basement air. The door was painted the same institutional green as all the others, bearing a simple placard, Service Stair B7. But according to every blueprint, every maintenance manual, every inspection I'd conducted over the decades, this wall was solid, had always been solid. The door handle was cold beneath my palm, colder than it should have been in the constant 70-degree basement temperature. It turned easily, too easily, as if it had been recently oiled. Beyond lay a narrow staircase descending into darkness, the same concrete construction as the rest of the building, yet somehow different. The air that drifted up carried a staleness that spoke of places long undisturbed, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of my apartment upstairs. I should have walked away, should have checked the building plans, called the super, reported the anomaly through proper channels. Instead, I descended. The first few steps felt normal enough. My footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell, the sound bouncing off walls that pressed close on either side. But as I continued down, the echoes began to change, becoming softer, more muffled, as if the very air was growing thicker. My flashlight beams seemed to penetrate less and less of the darkness ahead. After what felt like 3 flights down, impossible given that the basement was already the lowest level, I reached a landing. Here, the staircase opened onto a corridor that stretched in both directions, lined with doors. The same institutional green paint, the same scuffed linoleum flooring, the same fluorescent fixtures casting their pallid light. But these lights flickered irregularly, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move in stuttering, unnatural jerks. The first door I approached bore a familiar number, 4B, my apartment number. My pulse quickened as I stared at the brass digits, worn and tarnished exactly like the ones on my actual door 23 floors above. The door itself was identical, same scratches in the paint, same slightly warped frame that sometimes stuck in humid weather. Even the small dent near the bottom, where I'd dropped a toolbox years ago, was perfectly reproduced. From behind the door came a sound that turned my blood to ice. The distinctive whisper of fabric against fabric, the soft rustle of clothing being handled. Someone was in there, moving around, and they were touching my clothes. I pressed my ear to the door, my breathing shallow and rapid. The sounds were clearer now, the slide of metal hangers across a rod, the soft thump of shoes being arranged. But underneath these familiar domestic noises was something else. Breathing that wasn't quite right, too slow and deliberate, as if whoever was inside was savoring each moment. "Hello?" I called softly, but received no response. The sounds continued, methodical and careful. I tried the handle, but it was locked, though I could see light seeping from beneath the door, the warm, yellow light of the table lamp in my bedroom. Shaking, I moved to the next door. 4B again. Identical in every detail. The same sounds drifted from within, the same careful rustling of fabric, the same measured breathing. But now I could hear something else. The faint squeak of my closet door opening and closing, over and over, as if someone was repeatedly examining its contents. I ran to the next door, 4B, and the next. 4B. The entire corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with perfect replicas of my apartment door, each one occupied by some unseen presence that moved through my belongings with deliberate, intimate familiarity. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my keys, selecting the one for my apartment. It slid into the lock of the nearest door with perfect ease, turning smoothly, but when I pushed the door open, I found only darkness. Not the warm darkness of an unlit room, but a thick, pressing void that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. "Who's there?" I whispered into the blackness, but my voice seemed to be absorbed before it could travel more than a few inches. From deep within that darkness came the sound of my bedroom dresser drawers being opened and closed, one by one, followed by the distinct rustle of my work uniform being unfolded and examined. The sounds were so precise, so intimately familiar, that I could picture exactly what was happening. Someone standing in my bedroom, holding up my gray maintenance jumpsuit, perhaps even pressing it against themselves to check the fit. I slammed the door shut and stumbled backward, colliding with the wall behind me. But there was no wall, only another door, another 4B, from which came the same sounds, the same careful examination of my belongings. The corridor had changed while I wasn't looking. Now doors lined both sides, stretching infinitely in all directions. Everyone bore my apartment number, and from behind each came the sound of my life being carefully, methodically explored by unseen hands. I chose a direction and ran, my footsteps echoing strangely in the fluorescent-lit space. But the corridor never ended, never varied. Door after door after door, each one identical, each one occupied by someone who knew the exact contents of my closets, my drawers, my most private spaces. Some doors were slightly ajar, revealing thin slices of that impossible darkness within. From these gaps came more specific sounds. The clink of my coffee mug being set down on my kitchen table, the soft whisper of pages turning in the book I kept on my nightstand, the distinctive groan of my recliner as weight settled into it. I stopped running and pressed myself against one of the doors, listening intently. The sounds from within were different now, not the rustling of clothes, but the soft, rhythmic breathing of someone sleeping in my bed. But the breathing was wrong, too deep, too slow, as if whatever was in there was only pretending to sleep while it waited for something. The fluorescent lights above me flickered more rapidly, casting the corridor in strobing illuminations that made everything appear to stutter and jump. In these brief moments of darkness between flickers, I could swear I saw shadows moving beneath the doors. Too many shadows, as if multiple figures occupied each replica of my apartment. I tried to remember how many flights of stairs I'd descended, how many turns I'd taken, but the memory was already becoming hazy, like trying to recall a dream. Had I come from the staircase at the far end, or was it the one behind me? Every direction looked the same, every door identical. From the door nearest to me came a new sound that made my skin crawl, the distinctive squeak of my bathroom medicine cabinet opening, followed by the gentle clink of pill bottles being examined one by one. Whoever was in there knew exactly where I kept my medication, knew the arrangement of every item on my shelves. I pressed my face to the cool metal of the door, closing my eyes and trying to think rationally. This had to be some kind of breakdown, some stress-induced hallucination brought on by years of routine and isolation. The building plans were clear. There was no service stair B7, no sub-basement corridor, no infinite row of doors. But when I opened my eyes, I was still there, still surrounded by the impossible architecture of my own repeated life. The sounds from behind the doors were growing more frequent now, more varied. I could hear my television playing the late-night news program I always watched before bed, hear my shower running, hear my alarm clock's distinctive beeping from multiple directions at once. It was as if dozens of versions of my daily routine were being performed simultaneously, each one perfectly accurate in its details. I began to notice other things. The air carried the scent of my apartment, that particular combination of old coffee, cleaning supplies, and the faint mustiness of a place where someone had lived alone for too long. The temperature was exactly right, matching the slightly warm stuffiness I maintained in my own space. Most disturbing of all, I began to recognize my own movements in the sounds coming from behind the doors. The way I dragged my feet slightly when walking from the bedroom to the kitchen, the particular rhythm of my footsteps on the creaky floorboard near the bathroom, the exact sequence of sounds I made when preparing for bed, the clink of keys on the counter, the soft thud of work boots being removed, the whisper of clothes being folded. But these weren't my sounds. I was here, in this impossible corridor, listening to someone else perform the intimate choreography of my life with perfect precision. I tried door after door, but each key turned easily, each handle moved smoothly, and each opening revealed only that thick, pressing darkness from which my life was being so carefully mimicked. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement in that darkness, the quick flash of a figure retreating deeper into the replica apartment, always just out of sight. The fluorescent lights overhead began to dim, their steady hum dropping to a lower pitch. The shadows between the doors grew longer, more pronounced, and I noticed that some of them seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the door frames, reaching across the linoleum toward me with impossible geometry. I found myself walking more slowly now, each step deliberate and careful. The corridor felt endless, but I was beginning to suspect it was actually circular, that I was walking the same stretch over and over while the doors rearranged themselves just outside my peripheral vision. From one door came the sound of someone in my kitchen, opening and closing cabinets with the exact rhythm I used when preparing my morning coffee. From another, the specific pattern of channel changing that I performed every evening while looking for something to watch. Each sound was perfectly calibrated, perfectly familiar, and perfectly wrong. I stopped at one door and pressed my forehead against its cold surface. The sounds from within were different this time, softer, more intimate. Someone was going through my dresser drawers, not searching but examining, handling each item with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. I could hear my socks being unfolded and refolded, my t-shirts being lifted and set down again. "What do you want?" I whispered to the door. But the sounds continued unchanged. Then I heard something that made me step back in shock. My own voice, muffled by the barrier between us, humming the tune I always hummed while organizing my clothes. But I wasn't humming. I was standing in the corridor, listening to someone else produce the unconscious melody that accompanied my most mundane routines. The lights flickered more violently now, and in the strobing illumination, I began to see that the doors were no longer quite identical. Small differences appeared in the moments between flashes. A handle turned slightly to the left on one, a scuff mark positioned differently on another, a number that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I realized I had been walking for hours, though time seemed to move strangely in this place. My watch had stopped at 11:47, the exact time I'd first noticed the footprints in the basement. But I felt tired, hungry, as if much more time had passed. The sounds from behind the doors were changing too, becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. I could hear what sounded like multiple versions of my evening routine being performed in sequence. One apartment where I was apparently eating dinner, another where I was watching television, a third where I was preparing for bed. But underneath it all was that same wrong breathing, that same sense of performance rather than genuine living. I tried to retrace my steps, looking for the staircase that had brought me here. But every direction led only to more doors, more versions of 4B, more careful examinations of my life's intimate details. The corridor had become a maze, or perhaps it had always been one, and I had only now become aware of its true nature. As I walked, I began to notice that my own footsteps were being echoed from behind the doors. Not immediately, but after a slight delay, as if whatever was in those apartments was learning the rhythm of my movement and then reproducing it. Soon the corridor filled with the sound of dozens of feet walking in almost unison, creating a polyrhythm that was both hypnotic and deeply unsettling. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, carrying scents that shouldn't have been able to exist simultaneously. The smell of my morning coffee, my evening meal, my freshly laundered clothes, all mixed together in an impossible olfactory collage of my daily life. I stopped walking and listened. The footsteps from behind the doors continued for a moment longer, before falling silent, but not quite simultaneously. They ended in a cascade of stopping sounds, like an orchestra concluding a piece with imperfect timing. In the silence that followed, I heard something new. The sound of my apartment door opening and closing, over and over from every direction. But these weren't the sounds of someone entering or leaving. They were the sounds of someone practicing the motion, learning the exact pressure required, the precise angle of the handle, the particular creak the hinges made at specific degrees of opening. I understood then, with a clarity that was more terrifying than any confusion, that whatever was behind these doors was preparing, learning, getting ready to replace something that belonged to me but perhaps had never truly been mine at all. The fluorescent lights gave one final, violent flicker and then steadied, but their light had changed. It was warmer now, more yellow, exactly like the lighting in my apartment 23 floors above. And in that familiar illumination, I saw that the corridor had changed again. The doors were still there, still bearing my apartment number, but now they stood slightly open. Through each gap, I could see not darkness but light, the warm, welcoming light of home. From within came the sounds of normal life, the gentle hum of my refrigerator, the tick of my wall clock, the soft whisper of air through my heating vents. I approached the nearest door and peered through the gap. Inside was my apartment, perfectly recreated down to the smallest detail. My furniture in exactly the right positions, my books arranged precisely as I'd left them, my coffee mug sitting in its usual spot on the kitchen counter. But sitting in my recliner, wearing my clothes, was a figure I couldn't quite see clearly. It was turned away from the door, facing my television, and all I could make out was the familiar silhouette of someone who might have been me, if I were sitting in my apartment instead of standing in this impossible corridor. I moved to the next door and looked inside. The same scene, but the figure was in a different position, standing in my kitchen, apparently preparing the same breakfast I'd made that morning. The same gray jumpsuit, the same careful movements, the same routine I'd performed countless times. Door after door revealed the same apartment, the same life, but with the figure in different stages of my daily routine. In one, it sat at my kitchen table reading the newspaper I'd left folded beside my morning coffee. In another, it stood before my bathroom mirror, apparently performing the same grooming ritual I'd completed hours earlier. I realized I was seeing my entire day replayed simultaneously, each apartment containing a different moment from my routine, each figure wearing my clothes and moving through my space with the precision of someone who had studied every gesture, every habit, every unconscious movement. But none of the figures ever faced the door. None looked in my direction. They seemed absorbed in their performance, committed to their careful recreation of my life with an intensity that spoke of deep purpose. I reached for the handle of the nearest door, intending to confront whatever was wearing my face, living my life, occupying my space. But as my fingers touched the metal, I heard a sound from behind me that made me freeze. Footsteps, real footsteps, coming from the far end of the corridor. Slow, measured, deliberate steps that echoed with the particular rhythm I'd learned to recognize as my own. I turned to see a figure approaching through the strobing fluorescent light. It wore my gray maintenance jumpsuit, carried my flashlight, moved with my slightly uneven gait, but its face remained obscured by shadow, and something about its proportions seemed slightly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate my appearance from memory rather than direct observation. The figure stopped several feet away and stood motionless, its face still hidden. We regarded each other across the impossible space, surrounded by the endless doors of my replicated life, while from behind each one came the sounds of my own existence being carefully, methodically performed. When the figure finally spoke, it used my voice, but the words came out wrong. Too precise, too carefully pronounced, as if someone was reading from a script of how I should sound. "You shouldn't be here," it said. "This is my route, my building, my life." I tried to respond, but found my own voice had become uncertain, less solid somehow. The words felt strange in my mouth, as if I were the one reading from a script, as if I were the one trying to remember how to be myself. The figure took another step closer, and I caught a glimpse of its face in the fluorescent light. It looked exactly like me, but perfect somehow. My features refined, my expression more confident, my eyes brighter and more alert than they'd ever been in any mirror. "I've been practicing," it continued in my voice that wasn't quite mine. "Learning, getting ready, and now I think I'm ready to take over the maintenance of this place, to live the life you've been neglecting." I looked around at the endless corridor, at the infinite doors leading to infinite versions of my apartment, each one occupied by someone who understood my routines better than I did, who performed my life with more precision and care than I'd ever managed. "Which one of us," I asked, surprised by how uncertain my own voice sounded, "is real?" The figure that looked like me smiled with my mouth, but with an expression I'd never worn. "Does it matter? I know your schedule better than you do. I understand your habits, your preferences, your fears. I can maintain this building more efficiently, live in that apartment more completely, be you more successfully than you ever were." The lights flickered one final time, and in that moment of darkness, I felt something shift. When the illumination returned, the corridor was empty except for me. The doors stood closed, their identical 4B numbers gleaming under the fluorescent light. But from behind each one came only silence. I was alone with the impossible architecture of my own existence, unsure which direction led home, uncertain whether home was a place I was welcome anymore, and increasingly unclear about whether the person who had descended those impossible stairs was the same one who would eventually emerge. From somewhere far above came the familiar sound of the building's mechanical systems humming their eternal tune, calling me back to my duties, my routine, my carefully maintained life. But I remained in the corridor, staring at the endless doors, wondering which one contained the life I was supposed to return to, and whether the person living it would recognize me when I tried to reclaim it. The footprints in the basement had been fresh, still damp against the concrete. But whose feet had made them? And who, exactly, was walking in whose shoes? Story 2. The carousel horses never stop watching you, even when the music dies. I discovered this 3 months into my job as night security at Wonderland Amusement Park, when the shadows between the game booths grew teeth and the air tasted like cotton candy mixed with rust. But it wasn't the peeling paint on the funhouse or the way the Ferris wheel creaked in windless nights that kept me awake during my shifts. It was the car. Every night without fail, as I made my final rounds and prepared to lock the main gates, I'd see it parked just beyond the employee lot. A dark sedan, engine running, headlights cutting pale wounds through the darkness. The first time I noticed it, I assumed someone had forgotten to turn off their vehicle after visiting the park. A simple oversight. These things happen. The radio played music, a soft, tinkling melody that reminded me of the lullabies my grandmother used to hum. Music box melodies that seemed to drift on the night air, threading between the silhouettes of dormant rides like invisible fingers. I should have approached the car that first night, should have checked if anyone needed help. Instead, I stood 30 feet away, keys heavy in my palm, watching the exhaust curl skyward in ghostly spirals. The melody stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Static. Radio static, like an old AM station struggling to find its frequency. And then, clear as if someone were standing beside me, a voice emerged from that electronic snow. My name, whispered through the crackling waves. I told myself I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks during long night shifts, especially in places like this where reality feels negotiable. I finished my rounds, locked the gates, and drove home without looking back. But sleep eluded me that night, and when it finally came, it brought dreams of carousel music played backward and voices calling from empty spaces. The second night, the car was there again. Same position, same soft exhaust, same ethereal melody drifting from its interior. This time, I forced myself to walk closer, my flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of my steps. The music box tune grew clearer as I approached. Brahms' Lullaby, played on what sounded like an old, slightly out-of-tune mechanism, the kind you'd find in a child's jewelry box, all delicate chimes and haunting harmonies. 20 feet from the vehicle, I stopped. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but I could make out the faint glow of dashboard lights and hear the steady rumble of the engine. I called out, asked if everything was okay, if anyone needed assistance. My voice echoed off the empty rides behind me, bouncing between the haunted house and the bumper cars before dissolving into the night. The music stopped. Static filled the air again, that familiar electronic hiss that seemed to emanate not just from the car, but from everywhere at once. The speaker system throughout the park, the abandoned ticket booths, even the payphones that hadn't worked in years. And then, cutting through the white noise like a knife through silk, came my name again. But this time, the voice didn't stop there. It recited my license plate number, letter by letter, digit by digit, with the precision of someone reading from a document. I hadn't even unlocked my car yet. It sat 50 yards away in the employee parking area, keys still in my pocket. There was no way anyone in that sedan could have seen my plates from that distance, especially in the darkness. I ran. Not walked, not hurried. Ran. Past the tilt-a-whirl, past the game booths with their dead-eyed stuffed animals, past everything that suddenly seemed to be watching me with predatory interest. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them twice before managing to unlock my car, and drove home with my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The third night changed everything. I arrived at work determined to solve the mystery. I'd brought my phone, prepared to record whatever happened, to gather evidence that would either prove I was losing my mind or validate the impossible. The car was there before I even finished my rounds. I could see it through the park gates, a dark silhouette against the empty lot beyond. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, I could see into the driver's seat. It was empty. The car sat there, engine running, no one behind the wheel. The headlights painted twin circles of pale light on the asphalt, and from the open windows came that same music box melody, now accompanied by what sounded like a conversation. Multiple voices, speaking in hushed tones about things I couldn't quite make out. I crept closer, my recording phone held out like a shield against the impossible. The voices stopped when I reached the 10-foot mark. The music continued for another few bars, then faded into silence. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, my own rapid breathing, and the low rumble of the unmanned engine. I reached for the driver's door handle, my hand trembling as it approached the chrome. The radio crackled to life. Not just my name this time, but a full monologue. The voice, neither male nor female, ageless and hollow, began describing my daily routine with unsettling accuracy. It knew what time I woke up, what I had for breakfast, the route I took to work. It described the contents of my apartment, down to the magazine on my coffee table and the number of coffee cups in my sink. It knew about the insomnia that had plagued me since childhood, about the way I double-checked my locks before bed, about the recurring dream where I was trapped in an endless hallway lined with mirrors. I stumbled backward, my phone still recording, as the voice continued its intimate inventory of my life. It described conversations I'd had with coworkers, mentioned the name of my third-grade teacher, recited the exact words of an argument I'd had with my brother 6 months ago. Details no one else could possibly know, memories I'd barely retained myself. The monologue ended abruptly, replaced by that music box melody. But now I recognized the tune for what it truly was. Not Brahms' lullaby, but something else entirely. Something that reminded me of the song the ice cream trucks played in my neighborhood when I was 7 years old. The same truck that used to appear every summer evening, its speakers crackling with that same electronic distortion. I backed away from the car, my recording still running, and as I retreated, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The license plate was a mirror image of my own. Same letters, same numbers, but reversed. As if someone had taken a photograph of my car's plate and flipped it horizontally. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room playing back the recording on my phone over and over again. But each time I listened, there was less to hear. The first playback contained the voice, the personal details, the impossible knowledge of my life. The second playback revealed only static and that distant music box melody. By the third listening, There was nothing but the sound of wind and my own breathing. The fourth night, I called in sick. I couldn't face that car. Couldn't deal with the voice that knew things about me that I'd never told another soul. I spent the evening researching the park's history, looking for accidents, disappearances, anything that might explain what I was experiencing. I found nothing unusual, just the typical urban legends that accumulate around any old amusement park. Stories of ghostly children on the swings, phantom sounds from closed rides, the usual collection of local folklore. But I did find something interesting about the lot where the car appeared. It had been the site of the park's original entrance back in 1962, before they'd expanded and relocated the main gates. For over 20 years, families had said goodbye in that exact spot, children clutching stuffed animals and cotton candy as they reluctantly left the magic behind. Thousands of departures, thousands of endings, all concentrated in that small patch of asphalt. I returned to work the fifth night, armed with new knowledge and a desperate need for answers. The car was there, as always, but this time I noticed details I'd missed before. The vehicle itself seemed to shift slightly in my peripheral vision, never quite the same model or color when I wasn't looking directly at it. Sometimes it appeared to be a modern sedan, other times an older station wagon, or even a pickup truck, but always dark, always running, always playing that hypnotic melody. I approached with more confidence this time, determined to touch the vehicle, to prove its physical reality. But as I drew closer, I began to notice something deeply unsettling about my own behavior. My footsteps echoed wrong, arriving at my ears a fraction of a second too late. My shadow fell at an impossible angle given the position of the car's headlights. And when I looked down at my hands, they seemed to belong to someone else, pale, unfamiliar, moving independently of my conscious will. The radio static began before I reached the car, building to a crescendo that seemed to come from inside my own skull. The voice returned. But this time it wasn't reciting facts about my life. Instead, it was asking questions. It wanted to know why I was there, what I was looking for, whether I remembered the accident. What accident? I tried to ask, but my voice made no sound. The air around me had become thick, viscous, like moving through invisible molasses. The car seemed to be receding even as I walked toward it, always just beyond my reach. The music box melody grew distorted, playing at half speed, then double speed, then backward. The voice in the static began to laugh. Not cruelly, but with a kind of sad recognition, like someone remembering a joke that had stopped being funny long ago. It told me that I'd been asking the same questions for months, approaching the same car, having the same realization night after night. It suggested that perhaps I was the one who was stuck, not the mysterious vehicle and its impossible radio. I looked down at my security uniform and noticed it was wrong. The patches didn't match any uniform I'd ever worn. The fabric felt synthetic and strange against my skin. When I reached for my phone to check the time, my pocket was empty. I couldn't remember driving to work that night, couldn't remember clocking in or making my rounds. In fact, when I tried to recall the last clear memory I had of being anywhere else, I found only fog. The car's engine revved once, a sound like metal grinding against bone, and then went silent. The headlights dimmed and died, leaving me standing in complete darkness. But the music continued, that endless music box melody that now seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the sudden quiet, I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. Slow, measured steps on asphalt, accompanied by the jingle of keys. I turned to see another security guard walking toward the employee parking lot, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the empty spaces. He moved with the tired efficiency of someone at the end of a long shift, someone eager to finish his rounds and go home. He passed within 10 feet of where I stood, but he didn't see me. His light passed right through me as if I weren't there. He made it to his car, a dark sedan parked in the employee lot, and I watched him fumble with his keys before unlocking the door. As he settled into the driver's seat and started the engine, his radio came to life with a soft, crackling static. From somewhere in that electronic snow, I heard a voice calling his name. The music box melody began to play, drifting across the empty lot toward the main gates, where he would soon make his final security check. I watched him drive toward the exit, and I knew that in a few minutes, he would see a car parked just beyond the employee lot. A dark vehicle with its engine running and its radio playing that hypnotic tune, and the voice in the static would whisper his name and recite his license plate number and begin the gentle process of helping him remember what he'd chosen to forget. I stood there in the darkness, finally understanding why the carousel horses never stop watching. They're waiting for the music to end, for the ride to finally stop turning, for someone to remember how to get off. But the music never ends. It just begins again, night after night, with a new voice calling from the static and a new set of footsteps approaching the car that shouldn't exist. The only question left is whether you're the one walking toward the mystery, or the one broadcasting from within it. And in places like this, where reality bends and memory fails, sometimes there's no difference at all. Story 3. The habit started innocently enough. My brother and I had always been observers, the kind of people who noticed things others missed. A crooked mailbox, the way shadows fell differently on Tuesday afternoons, the subtle variations in how neighbors walked their dogs. When we began recording license plates, it felt like a natural extension of our shared curiosity about the world's hidden patterns. We kept a small notebook in the kitchen drawer, its pages gradually filling with combinations of letters and numbers, locations where we'd spotted them, and timestamps precise to the minute. The ritual became meditative, morning coffee accompanied by yesterday's observations, comparing notes about which vehicles appeared most frequently on our quiet suburban street, theorizing about the lives behind each registration. Our mailbox sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, positioned where Maple Street curved away from the main road. The metal box, painted forest green to match our shutters, had developed a slight lean over the years, giving it an almost conspiratorial angle as it waited for the daily postal delivery. We'd taken to leaving our license plate observations there, folded slips of paper tucked between the flag and the box's side, a quirky filing system that amused us both. The morning I first noticed something was wrong, October mist clung to the ground like spilled milk, thick and reluctant to lift despite the sun's efforts. I approached the mailbox with my usual Tuesday offering, 3 new plates from the previous day, including an unusual vintage registration I'd spotted on a restored Mustang. My fingers, already stiff from the autumn chill, fumbled with the latch. Inside, alongside the expected bills and catalogs, lay a crisp white envelope with no postmark, no return address. Just my name typed across the front in a font that belonged to another era, the kind produced by manual typewriters with their slight imperfections and uneven pressure. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, heavier than modern stationery, with a texture that suggested age, despite its pristine appearance. The letter inside was brief, typed on matching paper. Your observations are noted. The blue sedan, license plate ending in 847, will experience brake failure on November 15, 2024, at approximately 3:47 p.m., intersection of Maple and Pine. No injuries will occur. I read it 3 times before the words settled into something resembling comprehension. The license plate number was accurate. I'd logged that exact blue sedan just 2 days prior. But the date referenced was still 3 weeks away, and the clinical precision of the prediction sent cold tendrils crawling up my spine. My brother found me standing motionless by the mailbox, the letter trembling in my grip. When I showed him the contents, his expression shifted through confusion, skepticism, and finally landed on something that might have been concern. Whether for the letter's contents or my mental state, I couldn't determine. That evening, we sat in the living room as rain drummed against the windows, discussing possibilities. Perhaps someone was playing an elaborate prank. Maybe we'd somehow attracted the attention of a local eccentric who'd been monitoring our license plate hobby. The explanations felt reasonable in the warm lamplight, surrounded by familiar furniture and the comforting sounds of our old house settling into night. But November 15th arrived with unseasonable warmth, and at 3:47 p.m., I found myself standing at my bedroom window, staring down at the intersection of Maple and Pine. A blue sedan, the same one from my notes, rolled through the stop sign and continued toward the main road. No brake failure, no accident, nothing. Relief washed over me until I remembered the letter's precise wording. The incident would occur at the intersection, not necessarily visible from my vantage point. I walked the 3 blocks to Maple and Pine, searching for any evidence of automotive trouble. Fresh skid marks darkened the asphalt near the eastern corner, and a small cluster of broken glass glittered in the afternoon light. A tow truck was pulling away as I arrived. The next morning brought another envelope. This time, the prediction concerned a red pickup truck that frequented our neighborhood, driven by the man who delivered heating oil to houses along our street. The letter specified that on December 3rd, the truck would suffer a blown tire at exactly 11:23 a.m. while traveling northbound on Maple Street. Again, no injuries were predicted. I began watching for that red pickup with an intensity that worried my brother. December 3rd found me positioned at various windows throughout the morning, tracking every vehicle that passed. At 11:23 a.m., the familiar rumble of the oil truck approached from the south. I held my breath as it passed our house, continued another 100 yards, and then lurched suddenly to the right. The distinctive sound of a tire failure echoed through the crisp air. The driver pulled safely to the shoulder and began changing his tire, just as the letter had promised. No injuries, just an inconvenient mechanical failure at the precise predicted moment. Winter deepened, and the letters continued arriving with clockwork regularity. Each envelope contained increasingly specific predictions about minor automotive incidents involving vehicles we'd observed and recorded. The accidents were always small. A fender bender in a parking lot, a dead battery on a cold morning, a minor collision with a mailbox that resulted only in scratched paint. The predictions were invariably accurate, down to the minute and the precise nature of each incident. I stopped sleeping well. The weight of foreknowledge pressed against my chest during the long winter nights, making each breath feel labored and insufficient. Knowing what would happen but being powerless to prevent it created a peculiar form of psychological torture. I considered warning the affected drivers, but how could I explain my knowledge without sounding delusional? My brother grew increasingly concerned about my obsession with the letters. He suggested we stop recording license plates altogether, remove our notes from the mailbox, perhaps even move the mailbox to a different location. But I found myself compulsively checking for new envelopes, driven by a mixture of dread and fascination that I couldn't fully explain. Spring brought warmer weather and a disturbing evolution in the letter's content. The predictions began extending further into the future. Incidents scheduled for late summer, then autumn, then the following year. The typewritten pages accumulated in a growing stack on my desk, each one a small prophecy of automotive misfortune waiting to unfold. But it was the morning in early May when everything changed. I approached the mailbox with my usual mixture of anticipation and apprehension, noting how the morning light caught the metal surface and cast long shadows across the driveway. Inside, nestled among the usual correspondence, was an envelope different from all the others. The paper was the same heavy stock, the typography identical, but this letter was addressed to both my brother and me. The contents made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the paper. Your vehicle, the gray Honda Civic, license plate ending in 392, will experience transmission failure on August 17, 2024, at approximately 7:15 a.m. while parked in your driveway. No injuries will occur. This will be the final correspondence. My brother's face went ashen when I showed him the letter. We owned no gray Honda Civic. Our cars were a blue SUV and a black sedan, both parked in the driveway where they'd sat for months without incident. The license plate number meant nothing to either of us. That evening, while reviewing our notebook of observations, I made a discovery that sent ice water through my veins. There, in my own handwriting from the previous week, was an entry for a gray Honda Civic with a license plate ending in 392. According to my notes, I'd observed it parked in what I'd identified as our driveway on a Tuesday morning, but I had no memory of writing that entry. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, the same slanted letters, the distinctive way I formed my sevens, but I couldn't recall making that observation. My brother examined the notebook with growing alarm, confirming that the entry was indeed in my hand, written with the same pen I'd used for surrounding entries. August 17th arrived with oppressive humidity and the kind of gray sky that seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket. At 7 a.m., I positioned myself at the kitchen window, staring at our empty driveway. Our blue SUV and black sedan sat exactly where we'd left them the night before. No gray Honda Civic anywhere in sight. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. 7:10 a.m., 7:12 a.m., 7:14 a.m. At exactly 7:15 a.m., a gray Honda Civic rounded the corner at the end of our street and pulled into our driveway. The driver was a woman I'd never seen before, her face partially obscured by sunglasses despite the overcast morning. She parked next to our SUV, turned off the engine, and sat motionless behind the wheel. I watched in fascination and growing horror as she attempted to restart the car. The engine turned over repeatedly but wouldn't catch. After several minutes of trying, she pulled out her phone and made what appeared to be a call for assistance. As I stood at the window, transfixed by this impossible fulfillment of the prediction, a white SUV crept slowly past our house. The driver's window was down, and I caught a glimpse of a figure that seemed to be watching our driveway with particular interest. The vehicle was too far away for me to make out specific details, but something about its deliberate pace and the driver's attention made my skin crawl. The woman in the Honda continued trying to start her car for another 10 minutes before a tow truck arrived. As the vehicle was being loaded onto the flatbed, I noticed the license plate for the first time. It ended in 392, exactly as the letter had predicted. But here was the thing that made my rational mind reel. The woman claimed she'd been trying to reach the address next door, not our house. She'd pulled into our driveway by mistake, thinking it belonged to the residence she was visiting. When her car failed to start, she'd called for help from what she believed was the wrong location. The tow truck driver examined the vehicle and confirmed transmission failure, a mechanical issue that, according to him, had likely been developing for weeks before finally manifesting that morning. As the Honda disappeared down the street on the back of the tow truck, I found myself questioning everything I thought I understood about cause and effect, about prediction and coincidence, about the nature of reality itself. Had the letter somehow caused the incident, or merely predicted it? Was there a difference between the two in a universe where future events could be known and documented with typewriter precision? That evening, my brother and I sat in the gathering darkness, neither of us willing to turn on the lights. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of accumulated impossibilities. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me he'd been having dreams where he saw himself walking to the mailbox and finding letters that hadn't arrived yet. Dreams where he was typing predictions on an old typewriter in a room he'd never seen, his fingers moving across keys worn smooth by decades of use. Dreams where he was someone else entirely, someone whose job it was to document the small accidents and mechanical failures that would befriend the people who paid too much attention to things they shouldn't notice. I told him about the white SUV, how I'd been seeing it more frequently in recent weeks, always driving slowly past our house, always with the same careful, watching pace. How I'd begun to feel observed in ways that went beyond normal neighborly awareness. We decided to stop. No more license plate observations, no more notes in the mailbox, no more checking for letters that predicted futures we didn't want to know. We would break the cycle through simple abstinence from the activities that had started it all. But that night, lying in bed with every muscle tense and my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider, I heard the soft crunch of gravel in our driveway. Through my bedroom window, I could see the white SUV parked beside our mailbox, its engine running but its headlights dark. A figure emerged from the driver's side and walked with purposeful strides to our mailbox. I crept downstairs in my bare feet, avoiding the steps that creaked, and positioned myself at a window where I could observe without being seen. The figure was medium height, wearing dark clothing that made specific details impossible to discern in the night shadows. They opened our mailbox and placed something inside, not retrieving mail but depositing it. Then they returned to the SUV and drove away with the same deliberate slowness I'd noticed before. The next morning, I found an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. But this time, the message was different. Some patterns cannot be broken through intention alone. The gray Honda Civic was never the end, merely a test of your attention to detail. Your observations have been more valuable than you realize. Continue watching. Continue recording. The future depends on witnesses who pay attention to what others miss. A new notebook will be provided. As I read those words, standing in the morning light with dew still clinging to the grass around my feet, I felt something inside me finally crack, not break entirely, but develop a fault line that would never heal completely. Because I realized that we had never been the collectors. We had always been the collected. The white SUV was parked across the street, waiting. The driver's window was down, and for the first time, I could see the figure behind the wheel clearly. It was myself, but older, wearing an expression of patient satisfaction that I'd never seen in any mirror. I raised my hand in a wave. He waved back, and I understood that some observations were meant to be made, some patterns were meant to be noticed, and some futures were already as fixed as the past, typed decades ago on paper that would always feel both ancient and impossibly fresh, delivered by someone who had learned to navigate time the way others navigate suburban streets. The notebook arrived that afternoon, exactly as promised. Story 4. The calls started at 3 in the morning. Not phone calls. Those I could have ignored, unplugged, silenced. These were different, rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from somewhere above my bedroom ceiling, like Morse code spelled out in desperation. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. Always the same pattern, always at the exact same time, always lasting exactly 17 minutes before stopping as abruptly as it began. My neighbors were experiencing the same phenomenon. I discovered this during an impromptu gathering in the courtyard the following evening, when exhaustion had driven us all from our apartments in search of answers. The elderly woman from 4B mentioned it first, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the sounds back. The young couple from the ground floor nodded in recognition, their eyes rimmed with the telltale shadows of sleepless nights. We compared notes with the methodical precision of people clinging to rationality. Every apartment in our block had been affected. Every resident had heard the same pattern at the same time, for the same duration. Yet when building maintenance inspected the roof, they found nothing unusual, no loose tiles, no pest activity, no obvious source for the disturbance. That's when I decided to investigate myself. The access panel to the attic space above my apartment was located in the hallway closet, a narrow square of painted wood that I'd never paid much attention to before. Standing on a stepladder at 4 in the morning, flashlight clenched between my teeth, I pushed the panel aside and hauled myself up into the darkness above. The beam of my flashlight cut through air thick with dust and the accumulated silence of decades. The space was larger than I'd expected, stretching beyond the boundaries of my apartment into what must have been the areas above my neighbors' homes. Wooden beams crisscrossed overhead like the ribs of some enormous sleeping creature, and the air held the stale scent of old insulation and forgotten spaces. I began to crawl forward, following the main beam toward what I calculated would be the center of the building. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my weight, and more than once I had to pause to ensure I wasn't about to crash through someone's ceiling. My flashlight beam swept left and right, illuminating cobwebs that trembled in the stirred air and patches of insulation that looked like cotton candy in the artificial light. It was then that I discovered the passage. What had initially appeared to be a solid wall between sections of the attic space revealed itself, upon closer inspection, to be a carefully constructed opening. Someone had removed boards and repositioned them to create a hidden doorway, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The work was precise, almost professional, not the crude hack job of an amateur, but the careful modification of someone who understood the building's structure. Beyond the passage lay another section of attic space, identical to the first, but belonging to the adjacent building. And beyond that, another passage leading to another building. The entire block, I realized with growing unease, was connected by this hidden network of passages running through the forgotten spaces above our daily lives. As I crawled through the maze of interconnected attic spaces, my flashlight began to reveal signs of habitation. Not the obvious evidence of squatters or homeless encampments, but subtle indications that someone, or something, had been using these spaces regularly. The dust patterns were disturbed in specific pathways, creating trails between access points. Scratches on the wooden beams suggested repeated contact, as if someone had been navigating these passages in complete darkness. And then I found the blankets. Beneath each access panel leading down to individual apartments, neatly folded and positioned with almost military precision, lay thick woolen blankets. They were clean, recently used, and arranged in identical fashion, each folded into a perfect rectangle and placed directly under the corresponding hatch. The systematic nature of their placement suggested routine, habit, purpose. I counted 7 blankets in total, 1 beneath each access point I encountered. 7 apartments, 7 blankets, 7 residents who had been reporting the mysterious sounds. The mathematical precision of it sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cool air of the attic space. But it was when I reached my own access panel that my understanding of the situation shifted from puzzling to profoundly disturbing. Instead of a folded blanket, I found a pillow. It was still warm. The fabric held the unmistakable impression of recent use. The indentation where a head had rested, the lingering trace of body heat that spoke of someone having been there mere minutes before my arrival. The pillow was positioned directly above the thin gypsum board ceiling of my bedroom, exactly over where my own bed lay below. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch it, confirming what my eyes were telling me. The warmth was real, undeniable, impossible to explain away as imagination or misperception. Someone had been lying here, listening to me sleep, perhaps for hours, perhaps for weeks. I snatched my hand back as if burned, the flashlight beam wavering wildly as my grip loosened. In the dancing shadows, I thought I saw movement, just a suggestion of something shifting deeper in the passage behind me. I spun around, sending the light beam slashing through the darkness, but found only empty space and the familiar pattern of beams and insulation. The silence was absolute, but it felt occupied somehow, as if the darkness itself were holding its breath. I began to retreat, crawling backward toward my access panel with increasing urgency. Every shadow seemed to harbor watching eyes. Every creak of the old building suggested approaching footsteps. The warm pillow remained behind me, a tangible reminder that my private space had been violated in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I lowered myself back through the access panel into the safety of my hallway closet, questions multiplied in my mind like viruses. How long had someone been up there? What had they been doing besides listening? Were they still there now, waiting for me to leave so they could resume their vigil? And most disturbing of all, why was my apartment different? Why a pillow instead of a blanket? What made me special in this hidden observer's routine? The next few nights passed in a haze of paranoid wakefulness. I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of the thin barrier between my bedroom and the space above. Every settling noise of the building made me flinch. Every shadow cast by passing headlights through my window seemed to suggest movement overhead. The tapping sound stopped completely. This absence was somehow more unsettling than their presence had been. At least the rhythmic pattern had provided a kind of predictability, a known quantity to focus my anxiety upon. Now there was only silence and the terrible knowledge of what lay above. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd found evidence someone might be living in the attic spaces above my building, that I'd discovered a warm pillow in a place where someone might have been resting. The physical evidence was circumstantial at best, and my own state of mind had become questionable enough that I doubted my ability to present a convincing case. Instead, I began to research the building's history. The city planning office held records dating back to the structure's construction in 1952. The building had been designed as affordable housing for returning veterans, with identical floor plans replicated across multiple blocks. What I found in the architectural drawings, however, suggested that the current configuration wasn't original. The attic spaces had been designed as storage areas, accessible through individual hatches in each apartment. Sometime in the late 1960s, renovations had sealed off most of these access points, leaving only the one in my building's central hallway. The official reason given was energy efficiency, but I began to suspect there might have been other motivations. A deeper search through newspaper archives revealed scattered reports of disturbances in similar buildings throughout the city during that same period. Residents reporting mysterious sounds, objects moved in their absence, and the persistent feeling of being watched. The stories were brief, buried in back pages, and always concluded with reasonable explanations: settling foundations, urban wildlife, the psychological effects of city living. But the pattern was there for anyone willing to look. I also discovered that my building had experienced an unusually high turnover rate over the years. Leases were consistently broken early, tenants left without providing forwarding addresses, and several apartments had remained vacant for extended periods despite the city's housing shortage. The current residents, myself included, had all moved in within the past 18 months. This revelation prompted me to pay closer attention to my neighbors' behavior. What I observed confirmed my growing suspicions that something was fundamentally wrong with our situation. The elderly woman from 4B had developed dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. The young couple appeared increasingly strained, communicating in terse whispers when they thought no one was listening. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, though none of us could articulate what that might be. It was during one of these observation sessions that I noticed the pattern in our daily routines. We all left our apartments at specific times, following schedules that seemed almost choreographed. The couple departed for work at exactly 8:15 each morning. The woman from 4B left for her daily shopping trip at 10:30. The other residents followed similarly rigid timetables, creating predictable windows when individual apartments would be empty. I began to suspect that our mysterious observer had been studying us far longer than any of us realized. The next logical step was to monitor the attic space during one of these predictable absences. I waited until Thursday morning, when the couple would be at work and the elderly woman would be at the market, then returned to the passage above. This time I brought a camera. The attic space appeared unchanged from my previous visit. The same dust patterns, the same arranged blankets, the same warm pillow above my bedroom. But something felt different. The air seemed more charged, as if recently disturbed. The silence held a quality of expectation that made my skin crawl. I began photographing everything methodically, documenting the blanket arrangements, the modified passages, the precise positioning of items. Through the camera's viewfinder, details became clearer: small scratches in the wood that formed letters, dust patterns that suggested recent movement, tiny fragments of fabric caught on splinters. It was while reviewing the photos later that I noticed something I'd missed during my actual exploration. In several shots, barely visible in the background shadows, there appeared to be additional modifications to the space that I hadn't observed directly. What I'd taken for natural variations in the attic structure were actually carefully crafted hiding places: alcoves created by repositioning insulation, spaces hollowed out behind false walls, areas where someone could remain concealed even if the main passage were discovered. The implications were staggering. Our observer wasn't simply someone who occasionally visited the attic space. They had created an entire living environment up there, complete with concealment strategies and escape routes. They had been watching us not as temporary entertainment, but as a sustained, systematic study, and I was apparently their primary subject of interest. The warm pillow had been a message, whether intentional or not, while my neighbors merited only occasional observation, hence the folded blankets positioned for comfort during brief visits. I warranted extended surveillance. Someone was spending hours above my bedroom, listening to my breathing, my movements, my most private moments. But why? The answer, when it finally occurred to me, was so obvious that I almost laughed at my own blindness. I was the only resident who had discovered the passages. My late-night investigation had been observed, my movements tracked, my discovery noted. The warm pillow hadn't been evidence of routine surveillance. It had been proof that my observer had been watching me explore their domain. They had been there the entire time, concealed in one of their carefully prepared hiding places, monitoring my reaction to finding their presence. The tapping sounds had stopped because they were no longer necessary. Their purpose had been to lure someone into investigation, and I had taken the bait perfectly. Now I understood why the building had such a high turnover rate. Previous tenants had eventually discovered the truth about their situation and fled. I was simply the latest in a long line of unwitting subjects, selected for observation and study until the psychological pressure became unbearable. But understanding the situation didn't provide a solution. How do you escape from someone who has made the space above your bedroom their permanent residence? How do you sleep peacefully knowing that every night someone settles onto a warm pillow directly overhead, listening to your most vulnerable moments? I began leaving my apartment for extended periods, hoping to break the pattern of observation. I stayed late at work, spent evenings at coffee shops, even checked into a hotel for several nights. But each time I returned, subtle signs suggested that my absence had been noted and my return anticipated. A book moved slightly on my nightstand, a chair positioned differently than I'd left it. Small changes that could be dismissed as memory lapses if I hadn't been paying such careful attention. The message was clear. Distance was no escape. Wherever I went, eventually I would have to return home. And home had become a place where privacy was an illusion, where the ceiling above my bed concealed someone whose purposes I couldn't fathom, and whose identity remained frustratingly unknown. I considered confronting the situation directly, returning to the attic space, and demanding answers from whoever I found there. But the logical part of my mind recognized the profound danger in such an approach. Someone who had gone to such elaborate lengths to establish this surveillance network was unlikely to respond positively to being discovered. They had demonstrated patience, planning ability, and an intimate knowledge of the building structure that suggested both intelligence and potential instability. Instead, I found myself adapting to my new reality with a flexibility that disturbed me almost as much as the situation itself. I began speaking aloud when alone in my apartment, providing a running commentary on my activities for my unseen audience. I left small gifts on my nightstand, books I thought they might enjoy, snacks that could be easily retrieved when I wasn't present. The gifts disappeared. This confirmation that my observer was indeed accessing my apartment when I was absent should have terrified me. Instead, I felt an odd sense of relief. At least now I knew the rules of our strange relationship. They watched, I performed, and somehow we had achieved a twisted kind of equilibrium. But equilibrium, I was beginning to understand, was not the same as resolution. The longer this situation continued, the more my grip on normal reality seemed to loosen. I found myself lying awake at night, listening for the subtle sounds of movement overhead, straining to detect any indication of my observer's presence. Sometimes I thought I heard breathing that wasn't my own, a rhythm slightly out of sync with my own respiratory pattern. Other times I wondered if I was simply losing my mind. The line between paranoid delusion and rational response to an impossible situation became increasingly blurred. Was I really being watched by someone living in the attic space above my apartment? Or had the stress of city living, combined with my own psychological predispositions, created an elaborate fantasy that felt more real than reality itself? The warm pillow had been real. I was certain of that. But certainty, I was learning, was a luxury that my current situation couldn't afford. Memory became unreliable under constant stress. Perception shifted when filtered through persistent anxiety. Even photographic evidence could be questioned when the photographer's mental state was compromised. What remained was the fundamental question that had driven me to investigation in the first place. What was causing the sounds that had woken me at 3 a.m? And now, as I lay in my bed each night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the absolute silence above, I realized that the answer might be far more disturbing than the question itself. The sounds had been real. The passages were real. The warm pillow had been real. But the presence I felt watching me now, the sensation of eyes in the darkness, of breathing that matched my own, of someone sharing my most private moments, that might be something else entirely. Something that had learned to mimic the patterns of human observation so perfectly that the difference between watcher and watched had become meaningless. Something that had been waiting in the spaces above our daily lives far longer than any of us could imagine. Something that understood that the most effective prison was one where the prisoner never realized they were confined. As I write these words, I can hear movement above my ceiling. Soft, deliberate, patient. The kind of sound someone might make while settling onto a warm pillow. preparing for another long night of observation. But I'm no longer certain who is watching whom, and I'm beginning to suspect that distinction may never have mattered at all. Story 5. The humidity clung to my skin like a second layer as I stepped out of the hotel spa. That peculiar dampness that expensive places never quite manage to eliminate, despite their marble surfaces and eucalyptus-scented air purifiers. The wellness retreat had been a last-minute decision. One of those corporate packages that arrive in your inbox when HR decides the office stress levels have reached litigation-worthy heights. 3 days of mandatory relaxation at the Grandview Resort, complete with massage therapists who spoke in whispers and served cucumber water in glasses that cost more than my monthly gym membership. The receptionist had been pleasant enough when I'd signed the guest book, her manicured fingers sliding the pen across mahogany. The gesture felt antiquated. Who signs physical books anymore? But I'd played along, even scribbling my Instagram handle below my signature with that particular blend of embarrassment and hope that characterizes modern networking. You never know who might be watching, who might follow, who might open doors you didn't even know existed. I should have known better. The notifications started that evening as I settled into my room on the 7th floor. The standard hotel setup: beige walls, geometric carpet patterns designed to hide stains, and windows that revealed nothing but the parking lot's amber glow. I'd been scrolling through work emails when my phone buzzed with the familiar chime of a new follower. The username was simple enough: Emergency Lens, with a profile picture that showed nothing but a black square. The follow was accompanied by a direct message containing a single photograph. It was me, leaving the spa. The image had been taken from an elevated angle, somewhere above and to the right of the main entrance. I appeared caught mid-stride, one hand pushing against the glass door, my expression vacant in that particular way people look when they think they're unobserved. The timestamp showed it had been taken exactly 47 minutes earlier. I stared at the screen until the automatic brightness dimmed, my own reflection ghosting across the image like a double exposure. Hotel security cameras weren't unusual, but guests weren't supposed to have access to the feeds. I told myself it was probably some automated system gone rogue, maybe a staff member playing an elaborate prank on the corporate retreat attendees. The second photograph arrived while I was brushing my teeth. This one showed me walking down the 7th floor hallway toward my room, taken from the same elevated perspective. The angle suggested the camera was positioned near the emergency exit at the far end of the corridor, where the hallway bent toward the fire stairs. I could see myself checking my phone, the exact moment I'd been looking at the first photograph. My toothbrush felt heavy in my hand as I studied the image. The emergency exit door was visible in the frame's edge, and I could make out what appeared to be a small, dark lens mounted just above the exit sign. The kind of equipment that looked official enough to belong but discreet enough to avoid questions. I rinsed and spat, the mint taste sharp against the growing metallic sensation in my mouth. The third photograph came at 2:17 a.m., jerking me from the shallow sleep that hotel rooms always provide. The flash of my phone screen illuminated the room in stark blue white, and for a moment I couldn't tell if I was awake or dreaming. The image showed me lying in bed, apparently asleep, though the timestamp indicated it had been taken 15 minutes into the future. I sat up so quickly that the room spun. The curtains were drawn, the door was locked, and I was alone on the 7th floor of a building that required key cards for elevator access. Yet somehow someone had photographed me sleeping in a bed that was supposedly private, secure, protected by multiple layers of hospitality industry security protocols. The perspective suggested the camera was inside the room, positioned somewhere near the window. I fumbled for the lamp switch, flooding the space with yellow light that revealed nothing but standard hotel furnishings, and my own growing paranoia reflected in the mirror across from the bed. I checked every corner, every vent, every possible hiding spot for surveillance equipment. The search yielded nothing but dust bunnies and the kind of deep-seated anxiety that makes your chest tight and your breathing shallow. When I finally called the front desk, the night manager's voice carried that practiced combination of concern and skepticism that service industry professionals perfect over years of handling strange requests from guests who've had too much wine or too little sleep. He assured me that hotel security would investigate in the morning, that guest privacy was their highest priority, that surely there was some misunderstanding. His words carried the weight of policy manuals and liability insurance, but underneath I detected something else, a note of recognition, as if my complaint wasn't entirely unexpected. The fourth photograph arrived while I was still on the phone with the front desk. It showed me sitting on the edge of the bed, phone pressed to my ear, speaking with the night manager. The image had been taken from the same interior position, but the timestamp indicated it was from 3 hours in the future. 5:23 a.m., a time that hadn't happened yet, but somehow already existed in digital form. I hung up without explanation. The next morning brought coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and a meeting with the hotel security director, a woman whose business cards identified her simply as Reynolds. She wore the kind of navy blazer that suggested former law enforcement, and spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to managing situations that fell outside normal parameters. Reynolds examined my phone with professional detachment, scrolling through the photographs while I explained the timeline discrepancies and the impossible camera angles. She nodded at appropriate intervals and made notes on a pad that she kept tilted away from my view. She explained that the hotel's security system had been recently upgraded, that there might be connectivity issues causing timestamp errors, that guest privacy remained their absolute priority. The emergency exit camera I'd identified had been installed as part of new fire safety regulations, but access to its feed was restricted to authorized personnel only. When I asked about the emergency lens account, Reynolds paused long enough that I could hear the air conditioning cycling in the walls around us. She told me that social media monitoring wasn't within her department's purview, but that she'd look into it as a potential security breach. The fifth photograph arrived while we were talking. Reynolds was mid-sentence when my phone buzzed, and the expression that crossed her face when she saw the screen made my stomach drop. The image showed both of us sitting in her office, taken from a camera positioned somewhere behind my left shoulder. Reynolds appeared to be gesturing toward my phone, captured in the exact moment she'd been explaining the hotel's privacy policies. The timestamp read 11:47 a.m. It was currently 11:23 a.m. Reynolds excused herself to make some phone calls, leaving me alone in her office with its motivational posters about teamwork and its filing cabinets that locked with keys she kept on a retractable cord. Through the window I could see guests lounging by the pool, their movements lazy and unguarded in the afternoon sun. They looked like people who'd never questioned whether they were being watched, never wondered if their privacy was an illusion maintained only as long as it remained convenient for others. I spent the afternoon in my room, curtains drawn, trying to identify patterns in the surveillance. The photographs arrived with mechanical regularity, every few hours, each one showing me in various states of ordinary existence. Eating room service, checking email, standing at the window looking down at the parking lot. But the timestamps remained inconsistent, some showing moments that had already passed, others depicting scenes that wouldn't occur for hours. The temporal displacement suggested either sophisticated digital manipulation or something far more disturbing, the possibility that my actions were being predicted, recorded before they happened, as if free will itself was just another illusion maintained by people who'd never learned to look for the cameras. The breaking point came that evening when I decided to file a formal complaint with the corporate office. I'd found the parent company's contact information online and spent 20 minutes crafting an email that detailed the surveillance, the impossible timestamps, the hotel staff's apparent familiarity with similar incidents. The email was thorough, professional, and desperate in the way that communications become when you're trying to convince strangers that your reality has become unreliable. I hit send at 8:42 p.m. The notification arrived at 8:44 p.m. The photograph showed me sitting at the hotel room desk, laptop open, typing what appeared to be an email. But according to the timestamp, the image had been taken at 6:15 p.m., 2.5 hours before I'd even opened my laptop. In the photograph, I was typing the exact email I'd just sent. I could see my own fingers on the keyboard, could recognize the concentration on my face, could even make out portions of the text on the screen. The complaint I'd crafted over 20 careful minutes had apparently been photographed hours before I'd written it, as if my decision to seek help had been anticipated, recorded, and archived before I'd even made it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward with the weight of observation. Every surface seemed to hide potential lenses. Every shadow might conceal equipment I lacked the expertise to detect. The air tasted metallic, charged with the particular electricity that comes from being watched by intelligences you can't identify or understand. I packed my bag with movements that felt choreographed, wondering if my decision to leave was being photographed even as I made it. The elevator ride down felt eternal, each floor marked by the mechanical certainty of numbers that decreased toward ground level, and what I hoped might be escape. The lobby buzzed with the usual hotel energy, guests checking in, checking out, moving through space with the confidence of people who believed they controlled their own schedules. The night manager nodded as I passed the front desk, and I wondered if he was expecting my departure, if it too had been predicted and recorded in some impossible archive of predetermined actions. Outside, the parking lot stretched beneath sodium lights that turned everything the color of old photographs. My car sat where I'd left it 3 days earlier, unremarkable among the rows of vehicles belonging to people who probably slept without checking their phones for evidence that their dreams had been photographed. I drove for 2 hours before stopping at a gas station where the fluorescent lighting felt harsh and honest after the hotel's carefully calibrated ambiance. While filling the tank, I checked my phone for the inevitable final message. It was waiting. A photograph of me standing at gas pump number 7, taken from an angle that suggested a camera mounted on the station's canopy. But the timestamp showed a future I hadn't reached yet. 2:47 a.m., still 43 minutes away. I was holding my phone in the image, apparently looking at a photograph of myself at a gas station. The recursive loop made my hands shake as I tried to understand which moment was real, which was prediction, which was memory. The photograph showed me looking at what appeared to be the same photograph, and that photograph seemed to show me looking at another image, creating an infinite regression of surveillance that stretched backward and forward through time like reflections in opposing mirrors. I finished pumping gas with mechanical precision, paid with cash, and drove home through streets that felt provisional, temporary, as if the entire landscape might reorganize itself the moment I stopped paying attention. The apartment I returned to looked exactly as I'd left it, but everything felt different. The furniture seemed positioned for optimal camera angles. The windows faced directions that would accommodate external surveillance. The mirrors reflected not just my image, but the possibility that every reflection was being recorded, analyzed, archived by systems I couldn't see or comprehend. I checked my phone one final time before attempting sleep. The emergency lens account had posted a final message. A single photograph showing me lying in my own bed, in my own apartment, apparently asleep. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 6 months in the future. In the image, I appeared older, thinner, with the hollowed look of someone who'd spent too long wondering whether their actions were their own or merely performances in someone else's documentation project. The bedroom looked different too, rearranged, redecorated, as if I'd been living there much longer than the lease agreement suggested. But what disturbed me most was my expression in the photograph. Even asleep, my face carried the weight of constant vigilance, the exhaustion of someone who'd learned that privacy was a luxury that could be revoked without notice or explanation. I turned off the phone and lay in darkness, listening to the buildings settle around me. Every creak might be footsteps. Every distant sound might be equipment being positioned for tomorrow's surveillance. Sleep felt like surrender, but consciousness offered no escape from the growing certainty that my life had become something I observed rather than something I lived. Somewhere in the walls, or in the building across the street, or in systems I lacked the imagination to conceive, cameras were probably recording this moment too. The moment I realized that the emergency exit I'd been looking for didn't lead outside at all. It led deeper into a building I'd never chosen to enter, whose architecture I'd never learned to navigate, whose purpose remained hidden behind lenses that saw everything and revealed nothing. And in 6 months, according to the timestamp, I'd still be here, still sleeping, still being watched, still wondering if the person in the photographs was really me, or just someone who looked like me, someone who'd learned to perform the actions of a life without ever quite living it. The last thing I remember before finally falling asleep was the sound of my phone buzzing with another notification, and the absolute certainty that I wouldn't check it until morning. A decision that had probably already been photographed, archived, and scheduled for delivery at precisely the right moment to keep me questioning whether the choice had ever been mine to make. Story 6. The bass hit my chest like a sledgehammer, each thump reverberating through my ribs until I could no longer distinguish between my heartbeat and the relentless 4/4 pattern that commanded the warehouse. Strobe lights carved the darkness into fractured moments, bodies writhing in frozen snapshots, arms raised toward the industrial ceiling like supplicants worshiping some electronic deity. I'd been standing near the concrete wall for what felt like hours, nursing the same warm beer and watching the crowd pulse with mechanical precision. That's when he found me, or maybe I found him. The sequence blurs when I try to recall it now, like trying to remember the exact moment you fall asleep. 1 second I was alone, shoulders pressed against the cold wall, and the next his fingers were wrapped around my sleeve with surprising firmness. He leaned close enough that I should have smelled his breath or felt the heat from his skin, but there was only the antiseptic scent of ozone that follows lightning strikes. "The rhythm doesn't want you sitting," he said, though his lips barely moved. The words seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than his throat, harmonizing with the low-frequency pulse that shook the building's foundation. I wanted to pull away, to tell him I wasn't sitting at all, but something in his grip suggested this wasn't a conversation. His fingers, long and surprisingly cold through the fabric, guided me toward the dance floor with gentle insistence. The crowd parted around us like oil separating from water, dancers stepping aside without looking, their movements still perfectly synchronized to the hypnotic beat. The lights strobed faster now, or maybe my perception had shifted. Each flash revealed new details: the beads of condensation on the massive speakers, the network of cables snaking across the concrete floor, the way shadows seemed to bend at impossible angles. But mostly I noticed his hand, still gripping my sleeve, never loosening despite the constant motion around us. When the beat dropped, everything changed. The warehouse plunged into absolute darkness, the kind that makes you question whether your eyes are open or closed. The bass continued its relentless assault, but now it felt like it was coming from inside my skull, vibrating through my bones and teeth. In that instant of blindness, I felt his grip tighten, then release. The strobes returned with violent intensity, and he was gone. I spun in place, searching the crowd, but saw only the familiar sea of anonymous faces lost in chemical euphoria. My sleeve, however, still bore the phantom pressure of his fingers. I rubbed the fabric, expecting to find it stretched or torn, but it appeared unchanged. Still, the sensation persisted. 5 distinct points of contact, cool and firm, as if he'd never let go. The next drop came without warning. Darkness again, deeper this time, swallowing even the exit signs and emergency lighting. The bass became a living thing, crawling up my spine and settling behind my eyes. Somewhere in the void I heard movement, footsteps that didn't match the rhythm, a displacement of air that spoke of something large passing nearby. When the lights exploded back to life, he stood 3 feet to my left. Same clothes, same posture, but now his hand extended toward me across the impossible distance, still somehow connected to my sleeve. His arm stretched like black taffy, maintaining its grip while his body occupied an entirely different space. The dancers around us continued their trance-like movements, oblivious to the geometric impossibility unfolding in their midst. I tried to step away, but the elastic connection held firm. His arm simply extended further, defying every law of physics I'd ever understood. When I moved right, he appeared on my right during the next blackout. When I pushed through the crowd toward the rear of the warehouse, I found him waiting behind me, his impossible appendage having somehow navigated through dozens of gyrating bodies without touching a single one. The realization crept in gradually, like cold water rising in a sinking ship. He wasn't following me. He was anchored to me. Every light drop, every moment of darkness, became an opportunity for him to relocate while maintaining that supernatural tether. His face remained expressionless throughout these transitions, eyes focused on something just over my shoulder, as if he were watching a performance I couldn't see. I began timing the drops, trying to predict when the lights would fail, and he would shift position. The pattern seemed random at first, but gradually I detected an underlying structure. 7 beats, then darkness. 11 beats, then darkness. 13 beats, then darkness. Prime numbers, ascending in perfect mathematical sequence. During the 13th blackout, I felt his breath against my ear. "Do you hear it?" he whispered, though his body remained invisible in the darkness. "The rhythm between the rhythm?" I strained to listen, filtering out the obvious 4/4 pattern, the synthetic melodies, the distant conversations. Gradually, I became aware of something else, a secondary beat that existed in the spaces between the primary pulses. It was subtle, almost subliminal, like a heartbeat heard through a stethoscope pressed against the wrong chest. When the lights returned, he stood directly in front of me, close enough that our chests nearly touched. His arm had contracted back to normal proportions, but his hand maintained its death grip on my sleeve. Up close, I could see that his eyes weren't quite right. They reflected the strobing lights like a cat's, but the reflections came a split second too late, as if the light had to travel through some additional medium before reaching his retinas. "You're beginning to understand," he said without moving his lips. The words arrived in my head fully formed, bypassing my ears entirely. "The rhythm doesn't want you sitting because the rhythm doesn't want you still. Movement is currency here. Motion is prayer." The crowd around us had begun to change. What I'd initially interpreted as random dancing now revealed itself as something far more organized. Every person moved in precise relation to their neighbors, creating wave patterns that rippled outward from the center of the floor. Arm movements traced geometric shapes in the air, while footwork described intricate mandala patterns on the concrete. The entire assembly had become a single organism, breathing and pulsing with unanimous purpose. "How long have I been here?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I spoke aloud or merely thought the question. "Time moves differently when you're properly aligned," he replied, his grip shifting but never releasing. "The rhythm has been calling to you for months. You felt it in your apartment, that persistent bass line bleeding through the walls from your neighbor's stereo. You felt it in your car, the way certain songs made your steering wheel vibrate in perfect harmony with your pulse. You felt it at work, the fluorescent lights flickering in patterns that seemed almost musical. Memory flooded back in disjointed fragments. The sleepless nights spent listening to that repetitive thump from next door. The way I'd started timing my breathing to match radio beats during traffic jams. The growing compulsion to tap my fingers against surfaces in increasingly complex rhythms. Had those experiences been real, or was this stranger somehow implanting false memories? The 17th drop arrived with crushing intensity. This time, the darkness felt permanent. The bass continued, but now it seemed to come from every direction at once. Above, below, within. I could feel the crowd still moving around me, their synchronized breathing creating subtle air currents that brushed against my skin. His hand remained attached to my sleeve, but now I sensed rather than felt it, like phantom pain from an amputated limb. "The warehouse is just a vessel." His voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "The rhythm exists independently of architecture. It preceded the building, and it will outlast the building. We simply gather here because the acoustics are favorable." When the lights returned, I was alone. The crowd continued their hypnotic dance, but my mysterious companion had vanished completely. My sleeve, however, still bore that familiar pressure, 5 points of contact that pulsed with each bass hit. I examined the fabric closely and noticed something that made my stomach lurch. The area where his fingers had gripped was slightly discolored, as if the dye had been leached away by prolonged contact with something acidic. I pushed through the crowd toward the exit, but the dancers seemed to resist my movement. Not aggressively, they simply failed to step aside, forcing me to navigate an increasingly dense maze of synchronized bodies. With each step, the pressure on my sleeve intensified, as if invisible elastic were being stretched to its breaking point. Near the warehouse entrance, I encountered a security guard slumped in a folding chair. His head nodded in perfect time with the beat, eyes closed, lips moving silently as if reciting a prayer. I shook his shoulder, desperate for some acknowledgement of the outside world, but he didn't respond. His skin felt cold and oddly rigid, like clay that had been left to dry. "Excuse me," I said louder this time. "I need to leave." He opened his eyes without lifting his head. The pupils were completely dilated, black circles that reflected nothing. When he spoke, his voice harmonized with the bass line. "The rhythm doesn't want you leaving," he said, then closed his eyes and resumed his nodding meditation. I tried the door anyway, but the handle refused to turn. Through the small window, I could see the parking lot bathed in orange streetlight. My car sat exactly where I'd left it, keys visible on the dashboard where I'd forgotten them hours earlier. Or had it been hours? The digital clock on my phone showed 3:17 a.m., but I couldn't remember what time I'd arrived. Behind me, the bass underwent a subtle shift. The primary beat remained constant, but that secondary rhythm, the one between the rhythm, grew stronger. It was hypnotic, almost seductive, pulling at something deep in my brainstem where logic gives way to instinct. I turned back toward the dance floor, and there he was again, standing in the exact center of the crowd, arms raised, swaying with fluid grace, despite having no visible connection to my sleeve. But I could feel his grip more strongly than ever, as if the intervening distance had somehow amplified rather than weakened our bond. His impossible reach now spanned the entire warehouse, threading through dozens of bodies without disturbing a single dancer. "The rhythm is patient," he said, his words arriving in my consciousness like drops of ice water. "It waited for you to recognize the pattern. It waited for you to understand that resistance only creates discord. It waited for you to realize that you've been dancing to this beat your entire life. You just never had proper partners." The crowd began to thin, but not in any natural way. Dancers simply faded at the edges of my vision, dissolving like smoke until only the core group remained. These final devotees moved with even greater precision, their bodies describing mathematical perfection in three-dimensional space. I noticed that many of them bore the same discolored patches on their clothing, sleeve marks, pant leg stains, collar bleaching, evidence of prolonged contact with something that left no other trace. "What are you?" I finally asked, abandoning any pretense of normalcy. "We are the rhythm," he replied, though now the voice seemed to come from multiple sources. "We are the spaces between the beats, the silence that gives music meaning. We are what you hear when you listen to the sound your blood makes rushing through your veins." The 23rd drop lasted exactly 13 seconds. In that extended darkness, I felt something fundamental shift. The pressure on my sleeve didn't just intensify, it spread, creeping up my arm like rising water. But instead of alarm, I experienced something approaching relief. The sensation was warm now, comforting, like being embraced by someone who understood me completely. When the lights returned, my reflection stared back from the warehouse's dirty windows, but the reflection moved independently, raising its arms when mine hung at my sides, swaying when I stood perfectly still. The discolored patch on my sleeve had expanded, covering most of my forearm with what looked like burn marks from invisible fingers. "Do you understand now?" he asked, though I couldn't locate him in the crowd. "The rhythm doesn't want you sitting because the rhythm doesn't want you separate. We are all connected, all part of the same infinite pattern. Your individual consciousness is just another beat in the eternal song." I wanted to argue, to insist on my independence, to demand release from whatever hold he had on me, but the secondary rhythm had grown so strong that I could barely think above its hypnotic pulse. My feet began moving without conscious direction, finding the pattern that the other dancers had already mastered. My arms rose in precise coordination with strangers who no longer seemed quite so strange. The bass reached crescendo, and every light in the warehouse exploded simultaneously. In the absolute darkness that followed, I felt the final transformation begin. The grip on my sleeve was no longer external. It had become part of me, woven into my very substance. I could sense the other dancers around me, not through sight or sound, but through vibration, through the shared pulse that connected us all in an invisible web of rhythm and motion. When the emergency lighting finally kicked in, casting everything in hellish red, I stood alone in an empty warehouse. The sound system had fallen silent. Cables lay disconnected and coiled like sleeping snakes. Dust motes danced in the emergency light's crimson glow, following patterns that seemed almost choreographed. My car keys were in my hand, though I couldn't remember retrieving them from the dashboard. I walked to my car on unsteady legs, started the engine, and drove home through streets that seemed wider than I remembered, past buildings that didn't quite match my mental map of the city. The radio wouldn't tune to any station, just static punctuated by brief moments of that familiar bass line bleeding through the white noise. At home, I examined my sleeve under the bathroom light. The discolored patch had faded to almost nothing, just a slight variation in the fabric's texture that might have been there all along. I showered, changed clothes, and tried to convince myself that nothing unusual had happened. Just another night at another underground party, fueled by substances that created false memories and phantom sensations. But as I lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of my apartment building settling into sleep, I became aware of something new. A rhythm underlying the random creaks and sighs of aging wood and metal. A pattern in the distant traffic noise. A beat that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My neighbor's stereo, silent for weeks, began its familiar pulse. I pressed my ear against the shared wall and felt the bass line travel through my skull like a living thing. The rhythm was identical to what I'd experienced in the warehouse, not similar, but exactly the same, down to the subtle mathematical progression of the beat drops. And beneath it, barely audible but definitely present, I could hear the secondary pattern that existed in the spaces between the primary pulses. The rhythm that didn't want me sitting. As I write this, 3 days have passed since that night. The music from next door has never stopped, cycling through the same hypnotic progression over and over. I've tried knocking on my neighbor's door, but there's never any answer. The building superintendent claims the apartment has been vacant for 6 months. Sometimes when the bass hits just right, I feel that familiar pressure on my sleeve. 5 points of contact, cool and firm, anchored to something that exists just outside the range of normal perception. I've started timing my breathing to match the rhythm, and I've noticed that my pulse automatically synchronizes with the beat drops. When I sleep, I dream of an endless dance floor where figures move in perfect mathematical harmony, their faces hidden in shadows that bend at impossible angles. The rhythm is patient, but it's also persistent. I've begun to understand that the warehouse was never the destination. It was just a recruitment center, a place where the rhythm could find suitable partners. Those of us who heard the secondary beat, who felt the pull of the pattern underlying the pattern, were never meant to leave unchanged. We were meant to become living amplifiers, broadcasting the signal to others who might be ready to listen. Tonight, as I finish writing this account, I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. They don't match any normal walking pattern. Too precise, too synchronized, moving in time with the bass line that never stops. The footsteps pause outside my door, and I know without looking that someone is standing there, waiting. The rhythm doesn't want me sitting anymore. It wants me dancing. Story 7. The fluorescent lights above Pump 3 have been flickering for weeks now, casting intermittent shadows that dance between the concrete islands like restless spirits. I've grown accustomed to their erratic rhythm during my midnight shifts at the station, the way they hum and buzz before dying for exactly 7 seconds, then blazing back to life with renewed vengeance. It's during those 7 seconds of darkness that he appears. I first noticed him 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday that felt more like a slow descent into purgatory than any earthly weekday. The autumn air carried that distinct petroleum smell mixed with the dying leaves from the oak tree that looms behind the service building, its branches reaching toward Pump 3 like gnarled fingers. I was restocking the energy drinks in aisle 2 when the lights died their 7-second death. And when they returned, there he was, standing perfectly still between Pump 3 and the narrow alley that separates our station from the abandoned hardware store next door. He wore a gray wool coat that seemed too heavy for the weather, its fabric absorbing the harsh fluorescent light rather than reflecting it. His face remained partially obscured by the shadow cast from the pump's canopy, but I could make out the angular line of his jaw and the methodical way his lips moved around the cigarette that never seemed to burn down. What unsettled me most was his posture, unnaturally straight, like a soldier at attention, yet somehow wrong, as if gravity affected him differently than the rest of us. I watched him through the reinforced glass of the store, my reflection ghosting over his figure, creating a disturbing double image that made my stomach twist. He stood there for exactly 11 minutes. I know because I counted every second on the register's clock, before lifting the cigarette to his lips one final time and walking back into the alley. When I stepped outside to investigate, I found nothing but the lingering smell of tobacco and something else. Something medicinal and bitter that reminded me of the hospital where my father spent his final weeks. The next night, he returned at precisely 2:47 a.m. during the same 7-second blackout. This time, I positioned myself behind the lottery ticket display, where I could observe him without being seen. He performed the same ritual, that unnaturally perfect posture, the methodical smoking, the 11-minute vigil. But as I watched, I began to notice details that defied explanation. His cigarette never seemed to produce ash, yet wisps of smoke curled upward in perfect spirals that maintained their shape far longer than physics should allow. The smoke didn't dissipate in the autumn breeze. Instead, it hung in the air like frozen breath, forming patterns that looked almost like numbers. It was during his third visit that he began to speak. I couldn't hear him from inside the store, but I could see his lips moving in a deliberate rhythm, as if he were reciting something memorized. The cadence of his speech matched the flickering of the lights above Pump 3, each syllable synchronized with the electrical fluctuations that had begun to occur more frequently. I pressed my ear against the glass, straining to catch even a fragment of his words, but the thick barrier muffled everything except the persistent hum of the refrigeration units and the distant rumble of late-night traffic on the interstate. That's when I made the mistake of stepping outside. The automatic doors wheezed open, their sensors detecting my approach with that familiar electronic chime that usually comforted me during the lonely hours of my shift. But tonight, the sound seemed too loud, too sharp, cutting through the October air like a blade. He turned toward me with a movement so fluid it seemed rehearsed, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. His features were ordinary enough: thin nose, pale skin, eyes that might have been brown or green in different light. But there was something in his expression, a knowing quality that suggested he had been expecting this moment, perhaps even orchestrating it. His lips curved into what might have been a smile, though it never quite reached his eyes. 3:15 tomorrow morning, he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between us despite its conversational volume. You'll take your break at 3:15, 7 minutes and 32 seconds. The specificity of his statement hit me like cold water. My break schedule wasn't predetermined. I took breaks when the store was empty, when the late-night rush died down to nothing but the occasional trucker stopping for coffee and diesel. There was no way he could know when I would take my next break, let alone predict it down to the second. I opened my mouth to respond, to ask how he could possibly know such a thing, but he had already turned away. With the same fluid motion, he lifted the cigarette to his lips one final time, drew deeply, and then, instead of dropping it or crushing it underfoot like any normal person would, he simply let it fall from his fingers. The cigarette landed filter up on the asphalt, and impossibly, it remained standing. The burning tip glowed like a tiny beacon, but instead of the red-orange ember I expected, it pulsed with a cold, blue-white light that reminded me of winter mornings and morgue fluorescence. Ash began to fall from the standing cigarette in a steady stream, but rather than scattering in the breeze, the gray particles arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the base. I watched, frozen in place, as more ash accumulated, forming intricate patterns within the circle. The design gradually took shape, a clock face with 12 distinct points marking the hours. But the hands, formed from the darkest ash, moved in the wrong direction, sweeping counterclockwise with mechanical precision. By the time I found the courage to move closer, he had vanished into the alley. The cigarette continued to burn in its impossible vertical position, the ash clock continuing its backward march through time. I knelt beside it, close enough to feel the unnatural cold radiating from the ember, close enough to see that the hands pointed to 3:15. I don't remember walking back into the store, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, I was standing behind the counter, staring at my reflection in the black screen of the security monitor. My face looked pale and drawn, older somehow, as if the encounter had aged me in ways that couldn't be measured in minutes or hours. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of routine tasks performed on autopilot. I restocked merchandise, cleaned the coffee machines, and processed the occasional transaction with customers who seemed to exist at the periphery of my consciousness. But my attention remained fixed on the view through the window, where the impossible cigarette continued to burn, its ash clock marking time in reverse. At exactly 3:15 a.m., I felt an overwhelming compulsion to step outside. The urge came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, as if my body had been programmed to respond to an invisible signal. I tried to resist, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white, but the compulsion grew stronger with each passing second. Finally, I gave in, telling myself I was just going to check the pump readings, a routine task that needed to be done anyway. The moment I stepped outside, the automatic timer in my head began counting. 7 minutes and 32 seconds. I knew with absolute certainty that I would return to the store in exactly that amount of time, though I couldn't explain how I knew or why it mattered. The ash clock had grown more elaborate during the hours since his visit. The patterns were more complex now, resembling the intricate mechanisms of an antique timepiece. As I watched, new ash continued to fall from the standing cigarette, adding details to the design. Tiny gears and springs and wheels that seemed to turn and mesh with mechanical precision. I knelt again, studying the impossible construction. The ash was cold to the touch, colder than the October air around me, and when I tried to brush a small portion away with my finger, it reformed instantly, as if the pattern existed independent of the physical ash that gave it shape. 7 minutes and 32 seconds later, I found myself back inside the store, though I had no memory of walking there. The transition felt seamless, like waking from a dream only to discover that the dream was reality, and reality was something else entirely. This became the pattern. Every night at 2:47 a.m., during the 7-second blackout, he would appear. Every night he would announce the exact time of my next break, down to the second. And every night I would find myself compelled to take that break at precisely the predicted moment, standing over the ash clock that grew more complex with each passing day. The cigarette never burned down. If anything, it seemed to grow longer, more substantial, as if it were feeding on something other than tobacco. The flame that crowned it had shifted from blue-white to deep purple, casting strange shadows that moved independently of any light source I could identify. I began documenting everything, the exact times, the duration of each break, the evolving patterns in the ash. I filled a notebook with observations, sketches, theories that led nowhere. I considered calling in sick, finding excuses to avoid the night shift, but somehow I knew that wouldn't help. This wasn't about the job or the location. It was about me, about something that had marked me for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. Sleep became elusive during my days off. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through possibilities that ranged from elaborate pranks to supernatural intervention to the gradual dissolution of my sanity. None of the explanations felt adequate. A prank couldn't account for the standing cigarette or the impossible ash patterns. Supernatural forces belonged to movies and ghost stories, not to the mundane reality of working the graveyard shift at a gas station. And madness felt too simple, too convenient, a catch-all explanation that solved nothing. The worst part was the waiting. Each night as 2:47 approached, I would find myself growing tense, my heart rate increasing, my palms sweating despite the autumn chill that seeped through the store's inadequate insulation. I began to dread the 7-second blackout, yet also anticipate it with a hunger that disturbed me more than any supernatural explanation could. During the 4th week, the ash clock began to chime. The sound was barely audible at first, a soft metallic ping that coincided with the backward movement of the ash hands. But each night the chimes grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant background noise that followed me even when I was inside the store. The sound reminded me of wind chimes in a graveyard, or the distant ringing of church bells heard through thick fog. It was during this time that I began to notice other changes. Customers who had been regulars for months suddenly looked different, their faces slightly wrong, as if someone had attempted to recreate them from imperfect memory. The woman who bought coffee and cigarettes every morning at 6 a.m. still came in at the same time, still ordered the same items, but her eyes were now different colors, and her voice carried an accent that hadn't been there before. The delivery drivers who restocked our shelves spoke in languages I didn't recognize, though they responded appropriately when I spoke to them in English. The beer distributor who had been flirting with me for 2 years suddenly acted as if we'd never met, requiring me to show identification and explain policies he had helped me implement. I began to suspect that I was losing time, experiencing gaps in consciousness that I couldn't account for. I started keeping a detailed log of my activities, noting every transaction, every customer interaction, every routine task. But when I reviewed the logs the next day, I would find entries written in my handwriting that I had no memory of creating, observations about customers I didn't remember serving, notes about conversations that had never taken place. The most disturbing entries were the ones that described my breaks. According to the log, I was taking far more breaks than I remembered, sometimes 3 or 4 per night. Always at times he had predicted with mathematical precision. These breaks apparently lasted much longer than I thought, sometimes hours rather than minutes, yet the security cameras showed no gaps in coverage, no periods when the store was left unattended. I began to wonder if I was experiencing some form of split consciousness, if part of me was living through experiences that my conscious mind couldn't access. The thought terrified me more than any supernatural explanation, because it suggested that I was no longer in control of my own life, that something or someone else was directing my actions during these lost periods. The ash clock now covered an area roughly 6 feet in diameter, its patterns so intricate they resembled the blueprint for some impossibly complex machine. New elements appeared each night, additional clock faces showing different times, all moving backward at different speeds. Some showed hours, others minutes, still others seconds that ticked away in reverse with metronomic precision. I tried disturbing the pattern several times, sweeping portions of it away with my foot or scattering it with my hands. But the ash always reformed, usually within seconds, as if the pattern existed in some dimension parallel to the physical ash that made it visible. More unsettling was the discovery that after each attempt at destruction, the pattern would be slightly different upon reformation. Not wrong exactly, but evolved, as if my interference had triggered some form of adaptive response. On a Thursday night in early November, something changed. He appeared as usual during the 7-second blackout, took his position between pump 3 and the alley, lit what appeared to be the same impossible cigarette. But instead of standing in silence for 11 minutes, he began to walk slowly around the ash clock, his movements precise and ritualistic. As he circled the pattern, I noticed that the various clock faces began to synchronize, their backward-moving hands aligning to show the same impossible time. The chiming grew louder, more urgent, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in my bones. And for the first time since this began, he looked directly at me through the store window. His eyes were no longer brown or green but black, not dark brown or pupil-dilated black, but the absolute absence of color, as if someone had cut holes in his face that led to empty space. When our gazes met, I felt something shift inside my head, a sensation like falling backward through my own memories. Suddenly, I understood that the backward-moving clocks weren't just marking time in reverse. They were unwinding my life, pulling me back through moments I had already lived, experiences I had already survived. Each tick of those impossible hands was stealing seconds from my future and adding them to some cosmic debt I didn't remember accumulating. The realization came with perfect clarity. I was dying in reverse, aging backward 1 second at a time, and eventually, I would reach the moment of my birth and simply cease. Not die in any conventional sense, but unravel completely, as if I had never existed at all. But even as this terrible knowledge filled my mind, I couldn't be certain it was real. The human brain, pushed beyond its limits, is capable of constructing elaborate delusions that feel more convincing than reality itself. Perhaps none of this was happening. Perhaps I was simply a man working too many night shifts, his mind fracturing under the weight of isolation and fluorescent lighting, and the persistent smell of gasoline and industrial coffee. Yet here I am, writing these words during what may be my final break, watching the ash clock's hands sweep backward through time while he stands sentinel beside pump 3. The cigarette burns with its impossible purple flame. The chimes grow louder with each passing moment, and I can feel myself becoming younger, lighter, less substantial with every backward second. I don't know if anyone will find this notebook, or if it will survive whatever process is unmaking me. I don't know if the man beside pump 3 is real, or if he's a projection of my fragmenting psyche. I don't even know if this gas station exists, or if I'm lying in some hospital bed, my mind constructing elaborate fantasies while my body slowly fails. What I do know is that in 7 minutes and 18 seconds, I will take another break. The compulsion is already building, that familiar pressure behind my eyes that tells me I have no choice in the matter. And when I step outside, I suspect it will be for the last time, not because I will die, but because I will finally unwind completely, becoming nothing more than ash scattered on the wind. The lights above pump 3 are flickering faster now, their 7-second deaths occurring every few moments. Each blackout brings him closer, makes him more solid, more real. Or perhaps it's making me less real. I can no longer tell the difference. The backward clock shows 11:43 p.m., though the register claims it's 4:12 a.m. Time has become negotiable, subject to revision, and I am caught between two versions of reality that cannot both be true. In 6 minutes and 57 seconds, I will step outside one final time. The ash clock is calling to me, its chimes now loud enough to rattle the windows, and I know that when I kneel beside that impossible cigarette, I will finally understand everything, or nothing at all. The choice between enlightenment and madness may be no choice at all. Story 8. The carousel music had been playing the same warped melody for 20 minutes, each note slightly off pitch, creating a discord that seemed to crawl under my skin. I stood in line for the splash zone, watching the artificial waterfall crash down in predictable intervals, each cascade sending up clouds of mist that caught the afternoon light like suspended diamonds. The theme park's cheerful facade felt wrong today, too bright, too forced, like a smile painted over a grimace. The man behind me breathed heavily through his mouth, each exhale warm against the back of my neck despite the 3 feet of space between us. I'd noticed him when I first joined the line, mostly because of his age, 40-something, maybe older, with graying temples and the kind of desperate enthusiasm that made you look away. He wore a faded band t-shirt from the 90s and kept checking his phone, typing messages with the urgent tap-tap-tap of someone trying to reconnect with something slipping away. When his hand touched my shoulder blade, I froze. The contact was brief but deliberate, fingers pressing through my shirt fabric with the familiarity of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. I turned, expecting to see confusion or embarrassment, but his face held something else entirely, a moment of perfect certainty before reality crashed back. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice carrying the hollow echo of genuine shock. "I thought you were someone else." The way he said it made my stomach clench. Not the casual mistake of touching a stranger, but the recognition of something that shouldn't exist. His eyes lingered on mine for a heartbeat too long, searching for something I couldn't name, before he stepped back and became just another face in the crowd. I moved forward in line, but the feeling of his touch remained, a phantom pressure that seemed to pulse with my heartbeat. The cheerful screams from the ride ahead sounded different now, less joyful and more desperate, as if the people plummeting through the artificial waterfall were falling toward something far worse than a splash pool. The line crawled forward with mechanical precision. Children clutched cotton candy that left their fingers sticky and pink. Teenagers posed for selfies with exaggerated expressions of terror and delight. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it should be, except for the growing certainty that I was being watched. Not by the man behind me. He'd become absorbed in his phone again, thumbs moving frantically across the screen. This was something else, a weight of attention that seemed to press against my peripheral vision. I tried to locate the source, scanning the crowd with practiced casualness, but found only the usual collection of families and thrill-seekers, each absorbed in their own small dramas. The splash zone loomed ahead, a mountain of fiberglass and concrete designed to look like a natural cave system. Water thundered down its face in sheets, pooling at the bottom before being cycled back to the top through hidden pumps. The engineering was impressive, but there was something unsettling about the artificial nature of it all. The way the rocks were too perfect, the water too clean, the danger too carefully controlled. I climbed into the ride vehicle, a boat-like contraption with safety bars that locked with an ominous click. The seat was still damp from the previous riders, the moisture seeping through my jeans with uncomfortable intimacy. As we began the slow climb toward the first drop, I found myself thinking about the man's touch, the way his fingers had known exactly where to find my shoulder blade, as if he'd done it before. The first drop came without warning, gravity taking hold with ruthless efficiency. Water exploded around us in carefully choreographed chaos, and for a moment, suspended between terror and exhilaration, I forgot about everything else. But as we splashed into the pool at the bottom, something caught my eye. Foam from the impact had scattered across the concrete walkway, white bubbles catching the light like scattered pearls. At first it seemed random, just the natural result of water meeting air at high velocity. But as I watched, the foam began to settle into patterns, shifting and regrouping with impossible precision. Letter by letter, my name appeared in the foam, not printed or sprayed, but formed by the natural movement of bubbles finding their destined positions. Each letter took shape with deliberate slowness, as if the water itself was learning to write. The D formed first, a perfect curve of interlocking bubbles. Then the A, an apex of foam that held its triangular shape despite the gentle breeze. The remaining letters followed in sequence, each one more impossible than the last. My hands gripped the safety bar until my knuckles went white. Other passengers climbed out of their boats, chattering about the ride's intensity, but none of them seemed to notice the foam letters spelling out my identity on the ground. They stepped through the display without acknowledgement, their feet scattering the bubbles back into meaningless chaos. But the letters reformed. Again and again, no matter how many people walked through them, the foam returned to spell my name with mechanical persistence. I stood frozen on the exit platform, watching this impossible choreography, while the crowd flowed around me like water around a stone. The foam letters pointed toward a maintenance door I hadn't noticed before. Small and unmarked, set into the artificial rock face as if it had grown there naturally. The kind of door that's meant to be invisible, designed to maintain the illusion that this manufactured wilderness needed no human intervention. I followed the foam arrow across the walkway, each step feeling predetermined, as if I was walking along rails laid down long before I'd arrived. The maintenance door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A small placard hung from the handle, the kind used for out-of-order notices or safety warnings. But this one contained only 2 words, written in block letters with black marker, "Now yes." The handwriting was my own. I stared at the note, my mind struggling to process this impossibility. The letters were unmistakably mine, the slightly slanted N, the way I made my Y with an exaggerated curve, the peculiar way I crossed my S. I'd written these words, but I had no memory of doing so. No memory of approaching this door, of finding a marker, of deciding what message to leave. The foam letters behind me pulsed gently in my peripheral vision, reforming themselves each time the breeze threatened to scatter them. The maintenance door swayed slightly on its hinges, darkness beyond revealing nothing and everything. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling with something between anticipation and dread. The metal was warm to the touch, as if someone had been gripping it moments before. As I pulled the door wider, the smell hit me, not the expected mustiness of a utility closet, but something organic and familiar. The scent of my own apartment, down to the specific combination of coffee grounds and morning sunlight that characterized my kitchen. Beyond the threshold lay not a maintenance room, but a corridor that stretched further than should have been possible within the ride structure. The walls were painted institutional beige, lit by fluorescent fixtures that hummed with electrical tension. Doors lined both sides at regular intervals, each one bearing a small nameplate. My name appeared on every single one. Different versions, different handwriting styles, but unmistakably mine. Some were typed on official-looking labels, others handwritten in various pens and pencils. One appeared to be carved directly into the wood. They stretched down the impossible hallway like breadcrumbs, leading deeper into a maze I'd never agreed to enter. I stepped across the threshold, and the door swung shut behind me with a soft click that sounded final. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their frequency creating a subtle strobe effect that made everything appear to flicker between real and unreal. The carpet beneath my feet was industrial grade, the kind used in office buildings and government facilities, worn thin by countless footsteps. The first door on my left was unlocked. Inside, I found what appeared to be a perfect recreation of my bedroom, down to the unmade sheets and the specific way I'd left my clothes draped over the chair. But everything felt slightly wrong, as if the room had been built by someone working from photographs rather than memory. The proportions were correct but somehow uncomfortable, like wearing shoes that were technically the right size but wrong for your particular feet. A movement caught my eye. Myself, standing in the room's mirror, but wearing different clothes. The reflection waved at me with casual familiarity before walking out of frame, leaving the mirror to show only empty space where a reflection should be. I backed out of the room and tried the next door. This one contained my kitchen, complete with yesterday's coffee mug still sitting in the sink. But the mug was on the wrong side, and the coffee stain on the counter formed a pattern I'd never seen before. A pattern that looked suspiciously like a face when viewed from the correct angle. Door after door revealed pieces of my life, each one accurate in detail but wrong in some fundamental way. My living room with furniture arranged in mirror image. My bathroom with the toilet on the wrong side. My home office with a desk that held papers I'd never written, covered in my handwriting, but discussing events I'd never experienced. At the end of the hallway, a final door bore a nameplate that simply read, "Exit." But when I opened it, I found myself back at the theme park, standing in front of the splash zone entrance. The same line of people snaked toward the ride. The same carousel music played its discordant melody, and the same 40-something man stood exactly where he'd been before. He turned as I approached, his face lighting up with recognition that made my blood freeze. "There you are," he said, reaching out to touch my shoulder with the same confident familiarity as before. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The foam at the base of the ride began to shift again, letters forming with mechanical precision. But this time, instead of my name, the bubbles spelled out a different message. "Welcome home." I looked around the theme park with new eyes, noting details I'd missed before. The way other visitors moved in subtle patterns, like actors following a script. The way the ride operator's smiles never quite reached their eyes. The way the sun seemed to hang in exactly the same position it had been when I'd first arrived, casting shadows that hadn't moved despite the passage of time. The man behind me continued to breathe heavily, each exhalation warm against my neck. But now I realized it wasn't random. He was breathing in rhythm with my heartbeat, perfectly synchronized as if we shared the same cardiovascular system. "Excuse me," I said, turning to face him fully. "Do we know each other?" His smile widened, revealing teeth that were exactly like mine. "Of course we do," he replied, and his voice carried the peculiar resonance of my own recorded speech played back through different speakers. "We've always known each other." The foam letters pulsed gently on the ground, their message shifting again. "Now yes" became "yes now," became "now yes," in an endless cycle. The maintenance door stood open in my peripheral vision, darkness beyond promising answers I wasn't sure I wanted to receive. I could step back through that door, explore more rooms that contained pieces of a life I'd never lived. I could confront the growing certainty that nothing here was what it appeared to be, that the boundaries between myself and everything else had begun to dissolve in ways that terrified and fascinated me in equal measure. Or I could pretend that none of this was happening. I could chalk it up to stress, lack of sleep, the kind of minor psychological episode that happens to everyone eventually. I could get back in line for the splash zone and let the artificial waterfall wash away these impossible memories, returning to a world where foam doesn't spell names and strangers don't touch you with perfect familiarity. The man who looked increasingly like me smiled and gestured toward the ride entrance. "Shall we?" he asked. And I realized that this question contained every choice I'd ever made, and every choice I'd never had the courage to make. The carousel music continued its broken melody, each note slightly wrong, but perfectly designed to create exactly this moment of decision. The foam letters pulsed with patient persistence, waiting for my answer to a question I still didn't fully understand. I stood at the intersection of real and unreal, watching my reflection in a stranger's eyes, while somewhere in the distance, a door marked "Exit" led back to the beginning of everything I thought I knew about myself. The choice, whatever it meant, was entirely mine, or perhaps it always had been. Story 9. The cottage felt smaller than I remembered, its wooden beams pressing down like the ribs of some ancient creature that had swallowed me whole. 3 years away for graduate school, and now I was back in my childhood bedroom with its slanted ceiling and windows that never quite closed properly. The familiar musty scent of old pine and mothballs should have been comforting, but instead it clung to my throat like a question I couldn't answer. My parents had moved to Arizona 6 months ago, leaving the cottage to me until I figured out my next steps. The isolation had seemed appealing when I'd first driven up the winding gravel road, past the dense stand of birch trees that formed a natural barrier between the property and the outside world. Now, as evening shadows crept across the hardwood floors, that isolation felt more like entrapment. I'd hung my diploma on the wall beside my old desk, the same spot where my high school certificates had once displayed my modest academic achievements. The next morning, I found it relocated to a hook beside the kitchen window, a hook I'd never noticed before, positioned at an odd angle that caught the morning light in an unsettling way. The frame hung slightly crooked, casting a shadow that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Moving it back felt like a small victory, but the unease lingered. I told myself my parents must have repositioned it during one of their cleaning sessions before leaving. Yet something about the careful placement suggested intention rather than casual housekeeping. The lunch incident came 2 days later. I'd prepared a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on rye, cut diagonally the way my mother had always done, and left it on the counter while I stepped outside to check the mail. When I returned, half the sandwich was gone. Not eaten messily, but cut with surgical precision, the remaining portion arranged exactly as I'd left it, as if someone had simply erased part of it from existence. I stood in the kitchen doorway, studying the partial sandwich with the methodical attention of a detective examining evidence. No crumbs on the counter, no dirty knife in the sink, no sign that anyone had been there at all, except for that perfect absence where half my lunch should have been. The cottage's silence pressed against my eardrums. I'd grown accustomed to city noise, traffic, neighbors, the constant hum of urban life that drowns out the smaller sounds we're not meant to hear. Here, every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind through the eaves, demanded attention. I found myself holding my breath, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there, footsteps that might not be mine. Sleep came fitfully that night. I woke several times to undefined noises, perhaps the old furnace cycling on, or mice in the walls, or something else entirely. Each time I'd lie perfectly still, straining to identify the source, until exhaustion pulled me back under. In my dreams, someone walked through the cottage with careful, measured steps, opening cabinets and moving objects with purposeful deliberation. The next morning brought another displacement. My coffee mug, the blue ceramic one with the chip on the handle that I'd claimed as mine since childhood, sat unwashed in the sink. I hadn't used it the night before. I'd drunk tea from a different cup, which still sat clean and dry in the dish rack. Yet here was my mug, bearing the residue of coffee I hadn't made, as if my other self had risen in the night to perform a morning routine I'd forgotten. I began making lists, documenting each incident with the desperate precision of someone trying to prove their own sanity. Diploma moved to kitchen hook. Tuesday morning. Half sandwich disappeared. Thursday afternoon. Coffee mug used overnight. Friday morning. The act of writing helped temporarily, creating the illusion of control over circumstances that felt increasingly beyond my influence. The cottage's routines began to feel like shared custody. I'd find the living room rearranged subtly, cushions fluffed and repositioned, magazines stacked in different order, the reading lamp angled toward a chair I never used. Nothing dramatic enough to seem like intrusion, yet too deliberate to dismiss as memory failure. I started photographing rooms before leaving them, obsessively documenting furniture placement and object positions. The photos revealed discrepancies my conscious mind struggled to process. A book opened to a different page, reading glasses positioned beside it when I didn't wear glasses, a pen lying across a notepad as if someone had been writing in my absence. The sensation of being watched intensified during these discoveries. Not the paranoid feeling of unseen eyes, but something more intimate and disturbing. The awareness that someone knew my habits well enough to anticipate them, to move through my space with familiarity that bordered on ownership. 2 weeks into my stay, I decided to trim the forsythia bush that had grown wild along the cottage's east side. The morning was crisp and clear, with dew still heavy on the grass. I'd found the old garden shears in the tool shed, their blades still sharp despite years of neglect. The rhythmic snip of cutting brought a meditative quality to the work, the first genuine peace I'd felt since returning. As I worked, water droplets caught the early sunlight, creating tiny prisms in the air. The dew on the forsythia's leaves formed perfect spheres, each one reflecting the world in miniature. I paused to admire the effect, marveling at how these microscopic mirrors captured fragments of morning light. That's when I noticed something impossible. In the curved surface of a particularly large dewdrop, I could see the cottage's interior with startling clarity. Not the distorted fisheye reflection I should have expected, but a clear, detailed view, as if I were looking through a window. The image showed the living room from an angle I recognized, the view from the kitchen doorway, and everything appeared normal except for one detail that made my hands tremble around the shears. Someone was standing in the room. I blinked hard and looked again. The reflection persisted with impossible clarity. A figure stood beside the couch, partially obscured by shadow but unmistakably human in form and posture. The person appeared to be holding something, garden shears identical to the ones in my hands. I dropped my tools and rushed inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The living room was empty, exactly as I'd left it. No disturbed furniture, no lingering presence, nothing to suggest anyone had been there. I checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. The cottage yielded no evidence of intrusion. Outside, the forsythia waited with its dewdrop mirrors still intact. I approached cautiously, afraid of what I might see but unable to resist looking. The reflections had changed. Now they showed only the expected fisheye distortions of morning sky and surrounding trees. Normal, mundane. Nothing that should have shaken my understanding of reality, but I'd seen what I'd seen. That afternoon, I called my parents in Arizona, fishing for information about the cottage's history without admitting to my growing unease. Had they ever experienced anything unusual? Any problems with neighbors or intruders? My mother's voice carried concern I tried to dismiss. "You sound tired, sweetheart. Are you sleeping okay up there? You know that place has always been too isolated for comfort." I assured her everything was fine, but her questions lingered after we hung up. She was right about the isolation. Miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by forest that seemed to absorb sound and swallow light. The kind of place where a person could disappear without anyone noticing for weeks. The dewdrop incident marked a turning point. My careful documentation became obsessive surveillance. I set up my laptop to record the living room while I worked outside, hoping to capture evidence of whoever was sharing my space. The hours of footage revealed nothing but empty rooms and ordinary shadows. Yet the displacements continued with increasing frequency. Objects migrated between rooms, a book from the bedside table appearing in the kitchen, reading glasses manifesting beside chairs I'd never used, magazines open to articles I hadn't read but somehow found familiar. The cottage felt like a stage where two actors performed the same role in alternating shifts, never meeting but somehow aware of each other's presence. The morning routine became a ritual of discovery. I'd wake to find evidence of a parallel life unfolding in the same space, a coffee cup bearing fingerprints that seemed too large to be mine, Toast crumbs arranged in patterns too neat to be accidental. Newspapers folded to articles that interested me despite having no memory of reading them. I began leaving deliberate tests, small experiments designed to confirm or deny my suspicions. A pen placed precisely in the center of the desk would be found at the left edge, positioned exactly where I habitually placed my writing instruments. A book closed and carefully aligned with the table edge would be discovered open to a passage I'd been meaning to reread but hadn't yet reached. The responses felt like communication, not random displacement but purposeful interaction. Someone who knew my habits, my preferences, my routines well enough to anticipate them. The familiarity was more unsettling than outright intrusion would have been. 3 weeks into this strange cohabitation, I decided to maintain a constant vigil. If someone was sharing my space, I would catch them. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the entire cottage's main floor, laptop open, recording everything while I pretended to read. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Nothing moved except dust motes dancing in slanted sunbeams. No footsteps, no displaced objects, no evidence of another presence. Yet the sensation of being watched intensified until my skin crawled with phantom touches. I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, expecting to find someone standing behind me. But the cottage remained stubbornly empty. As evening approached, I needed to use the bathroom. A 5-minute absence at most. I left the laptop recording and hurried upstairs, moving as quietly as possible. When I returned, my coffee mug sat steaming on the side table. Fresh coffee in a mug I hadn't used since morning, positioned exactly where I would have placed it myself. The laptop showed an empty room throughout my absence. No one entering, no mysterious appearance of coffee. Yet the mug was real, the coffee hot and prepared exactly to my taste. 2 sugars, splash of cream, the way I'd made it every morning since childhood. I stared at the impossible coffee, its surface rippling slightly as if someone had just stirred it. The cottage's silence felt expectant now, as if it were waiting for my reaction to this latest impossibility. I lifted the mug with trembling hands and tasted coffee that was perfect, exactly how I made it, with the same slight bitterness I preferred in the evening. That night I didn't try to sleep. I sat in the living room, laptop recording, watching for any sign of movement. The cottage breathed around me with its old wooden sighs and settling groans, but nothing human stirred. Yet I felt accompanied, as if someone sat just outside my peripheral vision, matching my vigilance with their own. Morning brought a new revelation. Reviewing the night's footage revealed something that should have been impossible. At approximately 3:17 a.m., the image showed me rising from my chair and walking into the kitchen, but I remembered no such movement. I'd remained seated throughout the night, fighting sleep and monitoring the cottage's stillness. Yet there I was on the recording, moving with familiar purpose through my own home. The figure was clearly me. Same height, same build, same unconscious mannerisms, but performing actions I had no memory of taking. I watched myself prepare coffee in the kitchen, moving with practiced efficiency through a routine I knew by heart. The recording ended with my apparent return to the living room, where I seemed to notice something off camera that caused me to freeze momentarily, before continuing out of frame. Moments later, the me I remembered being sat down in the same chair I'd never left, completely unaware that anything had occurred. I rewound and watched again, studying every detail of my apparent nocturnal activities. The movements were mine, but the timing was impossible. I had perfect recall of the entire night, sitting vigilant in that chair, watching shadows and listening to the cottage's quiet breathing. I could not have been in 2 places simultaneously. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The cottage felt different after that discovery, as if it had finally revealed its true nature. I was not alone here, but neither was I accompanied by anyone external. The presence I'd sensed, the careful rearrangements, the familiar disruptions, they all belonged to me. Some version of me that existed in the spaces between my conscious moments, living a parallel life in the same physical space. I started paying attention to gaps in my awareness, moments when my mind drifted or attention wandered. Did I lose time during these lapses? Was there another version of myself performing actions I couldn't remember, going through routines that felt familiar because they were mine? The dewdrop revelations took on new significance. That morning when I'd seen someone in the cottage's interior, holding garden shears while I held identical tools outside. Had I been looking at myself from some impossible angle? Was the cottage showing me something my conscious mind couldn't process? A reflection of actions I was taking but not remembering? I began testing the boundaries of my own awareness, deliberately letting my mind wander while performing routine tasks. Sometimes I'd find myself in different rooms with no clear memory of moving, holding objects I didn't remember picking up, standing in positions that suggested purposeful activity I couldn't recall beginning. The cottage became a laboratory for studying my own fractured consciousness. I'd start washing dishes in the kitchen and find myself moments later standing in the garden with dirt on my hands, as if I'd been weeding flower beds that didn't exist. I'd sit down to read and surface from apparent deep concentration to discover I'd been writing in a notebook, detailed observations about the cottage's daily rhythms, written in my handwriting but containing insights I didn't remember forming. The parallel routines began blending together. I'd find myself reaching for coffee that was already prepared, sitting in chairs that had been arranged for my comfort, discovering books open to passages I was ready to read. The cottage anticipated my needs with an efficiency that would have been helpful if it weren't so deeply unsettling. My parents called again, their concern evident despite my attempts to sound normal. I found myself describing activities I couldn't clearly remember. Successful days of reading and garden work, productive mornings of organizing and cleaning. The words felt true as I spoke them, yet I retained no clear memory of these accomplishments. "You sound much better," my mother observed. "More like yourself." But which self was she hearing? The one who remembered our conversation, or the one who had been living productively in my absence from awareness? How many versions of myself were operating in this cottage, sharing time and space in ways my conscious mind couldn't track? The question consumed my remaining days there. I'd wake each morning to find evidence of a productive evening I couldn't remember. Notes written in my handwriting, rooms cleaned and organized, meals partially prepared. My unconscious self seemed more efficient and purposeful than the anxious person who worried about lost time and impossible occurrences. Perhaps the cottage wasn't haunted by external forces, but by the parts of myself I'd forgotten how to access. The careful rearrangements, the anticipated needs, the familiar routines, they belonged to aspects of my personality that operated below conscious awareness, managing daily life while my worried mind focused on mysteries that were no mysteries at all. Yet questions remained. If I was sleepwalking or experiencing some form of dissociation, why did my actions feel purposeful rather than automatic? Why did the cottage's responses seem interactive rather than repetitive? And most troubling of all, when I looked in mirrors now, why did my reflection sometimes seem to be looking back with recognition of things I couldn't remember doing? The cottage kept its secrets, offering only dewdrop glimpses of truths too complex for conscious understanding. I left after a month, returning to the city with more questions than answers, and a deep unease about the nature of personal identity. But sometimes, in quiet moments when my mind wandered, I could feel that other self still moving through those rooms, still tending to routines I'd established but couldn't remember, still living the life I'd thought I was living but somehow never quite experienced. The cottage waits for my return, patient and knowing, ready to blur the boundaries between observer and observed, between the self that remembers and the self that acts, between the person I think I am and the person I might actually be when no one, not even myself, is watching. Story 10. The rain fell like bullets on the asphalt, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments that seemed to dance in the humid Florida air. Animal Kingdom had transformed from a magical wonderland into something altogether more sinister, the storm clouds above churning like smoke from some unseen fire, casting everything in a gray-green pallor that made the artificial rocks and carefully landscaped wilderness feel suddenly, urgently real. I should have known something was wrong the moment my brother stepped away from our group near the Tree of Life. The downpour had started without warning, sending tourists scrambling for cover under awnings and into gift shops, their bright vacation clothes turning dark with moisture. Our family had huddled beneath the overhang of a closed snack stand, watching the deluge turn the walkways into rushing streams. When I noticed the empty space where he'd been standing just moments before, the absence felt immediate and profound, like a missing tooth your tongue can't stop finding. I called his name into the storm, but the rain swallowed my voice completely. The sound of water hitting leaves, concrete, and metal created a white noise so dense it seemed to muffle not just sound, but thought itself. My parents were arguing about whether to wait or seek better shelter, their voices becoming increasingly shrill as they competed with the storm's roar. That's when I decided to look for him. The moment I stepped out from under our makeshift shelter, the rain hit me with surprising force. It wasn't the gentle summer showers I remembered from childhood. This was aggressive, almost purposeful in its assault. Within seconds, my shirt was plastered to my skin, and water ran in streams down my face, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The usual crowds had vanished, leaving behind an eerily empty park that felt like walking through the ruins of civilization. I found him 2 minutes later, though those 2 minutes stretched like hours in my memory. He was standing perfectly still near the entrance to the Flights of Wonder amphitheater, holding hands with a man I'd never seen before. The stranger was tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be a khaki uniform that remained completely dry despite the torrential rain. But it was his face that made my step falter, smooth and pale as an egg, entirely without eyebrows, giving him an expression of perpetual surprise or perhaps ancient wisdom. As I approached, I could hear the man speaking in low, measured tones about the hunting patterns of raptors, explaining how birds of prey used weather systems to their advantage. He gestured with his free hand toward the empty amphitheater, describing aerial maneuvers with the casual authority of someone who had witnessed them countless times. My brother listened with rapt attention, nodding occasionally, completely absorbed in the impromptu lesson. The scene should have been innocent, a park employee entertaining a curious visitor during an unexpected weather delay. But something in the tableau felt fundamentally wrong, like a photograph that had been subtly altered in ways your conscious mind couldn't quite identify. The rain continued to fall around them in heavy sheets, yet neither figure seemed affected by it. Steam rose from the hot pavement everywhere except in the small circle where they stood. When I called my brother's name, both figures turned toward me in perfect synchronization, their movements unnaturally fluid. My brother's eyes held an expression I'd never seen before, not quite vacant, but somehow distant, as if he were seeing me from a great height. The stranger smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too uniform, like polished stones arranged in precise rows. The man introduced himself as an instructor of raptor behavior, explaining that he'd been discussing the magnificent hunting strategies of eagles and hawks with my brother, who had shown such remarkable insight into predatory patterns. His voice carried an odd cadence, each word enunciated with careful precision, as if English were a second language he'd learned through academic study rather than natural acquisition. He spoke of thermal currents and killing efficiency with the same tone others might use to discuss the weather. I reached for my brother's hand, intending to pull him back toward our family's shelter. The moment my fingers brushed against the instructor's wrist, ice shot through my entire nervous system. His skin was cold as marble, not just cool or clammy, but cold in a way that seemed to leach heat from everything around it. More disturbing still, his hand was completely dry. Not a single drop of rain clung to his skin or clothing, as if the water simply refused to touch him. The contact lasted only a second before he released my brother's hand, but that second stretched into an eternity of wrongness. I found myself staring at his fingers, watching raindrops strike them and simply disappear, not rolling off or being absorbed, but vanishing the instant they made contact, as if his body existed in some pocket of space where different physical laws applied. He explained that my brother possessed an unusual understanding of predatory instincts, that such awareness was rare and should be nurtured carefully. The words seemed to come from somewhere behind his face, rather than from his mouth directly. He suggested that my brother might benefit from more specialized instruction, perhaps during the early morning hours when the hunting birds were most active and the park was closed to general visitors. I managed to mumble something about needing to return to our family, wrapping my arm around my brother's shoulders and guiding him away from the amphitheater. As we walked back through the storm, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the instructor following us. But each time I looked, the area appeared empty, as if no one had ever been there at all. The rain had resumed its normal behavior, soaking everything uniformly, creating puddles in the low spots, running off surfaces in predictable streams. My brother remained oddly silent during our return journey, his usual chatter replaced by a contemplative quiet that felt more mature than his years should have allowed. When I asked him about his conversation with the instructor, he described learning about the patience required for successful hunting, about the importance of stillness and observation, about reading the subtle signs that indicated when prey was vulnerable. His words carried an intensity that made my skin crawl, not because the information was inherently disturbing, but because of the reverent way he delivered it. By the time we reached our family's shelter, the storm had begun to subside. My parents barely looked up from their phones, where they'd been tracking the weather system's movement across the state. They asked where we'd been, and I found myself struggling to explain the encounter in a way that wouldn't sound completely insane. I mentioned meeting a park employee who'd been discussing wildlife with my brother, carefully omitting the details that had left me feeling fundamentally unsettled. The rest of our day proceeded normally enough. We rode attractions, ate overpriced theme park food, and took the usual vacation photos. But I couldn't shake the memory of that cold, dry hand, or the way rain had seemed to avoid the instructor entirely. Every employee we encountered afterward appeared completely ordinary, sweaty, slightly frazzled by the storm, their uniforms bearing the expected stains and wrinkles of people working in challenging conditions. That evening, back in our hotel room, I found myself searching online for information about Animal Kingdom's raptor programs. I discovered that the Flights of Wonder show had been discontinued years earlier, replaced by different entertainment offerings. The amphitheater we'd visited was no longer used for bird demonstrations, though it remained standing as part of the park's overall landscape design. I also searched for staff members who might match the instructor's description, scrolling through employee photos and biographies on the park's educational program websites. None of the current or former staff resembled the man we'd encountered. More troubling still, none of the legitimate wildlife educators had expertise specifically in raptor behavior. That specialization belonged to a different facility entirely, one located hundreds of miles away. The photographs from our day told their own strange story. In every image that should have captured the area near the amphitheater, the background appeared normal, but somehow empty, as if the space itself had been carefully edited to remove any trace of human presence. My brother appeared in several shots, but always alone, never with the instructor who had supposedly spent so much time explaining hunting strategies and predatory behavior. Over the following weeks, my brother began displaying behaviors that concerned me increasingly. He would sit motionless for long periods, watching birds through our backyard window with an intensity that seemed almost predatory itself. His usual interests, video games, sports, social activities with friends, gradually gave way to an obsession with ornithology texts he'd somehow acquired from the local library. He could recite hunting patterns and territorial behaviors with academic precision, though he claimed no memory of studying such information. Most unsettling of all, he began talking about the instructor's lessons as if they were ongoing. He would reference conversations that had supposedly taken place during our sleep, describing detailed instruction sessions about reading air currents and identifying vulnerable prey from great distances. When pressed for specifics about when and where these lessons occurred, his answers became vague and contradictory, as if he were trying to remember dreams rather than actual events. I started experiencing my own sleep disturbances, not quite nightmares, but dreams filled with the sensation of being watched by unseen observers perched high above. I would wake with the conviction that something had been standing at the foot of my bed, studying my breathing patterns, and noting the precise moments when I was most vulnerable. The feeling was so strong that I began checking the locks on our windows each night, though I could never articulate exactly what I was trying to keep out. The dreams always featured the same elements: vast empty spaces viewed from impossible heights, the feeling of perfect stillness broken by sudden, decisive movement, and the absolute certainty that I was being evaluated by something that understood hunting in ways humans never could. I would wake with my heart racing and my mouth dry, tasting something metallic that reminded me of fear itself. 3 months after our Animal Kingdom visit, I decided to call the park directly and ask about their current wildlife education programs. The customer service representative was helpful and thorough, providing detailed information about all their animal-related offerings. When I specifically asked about raptor behavior instruction, she seemed confused by the question. She explained that they'd never had a program specifically focused on birds of prey, and that all their educational initiatives were conducted by certified staff members whose credentials were readily available for public review. More disturbing still, when I described the instructor and asked if anyone matching his description had ever worked at the park, the representative's tone shifted noticeably. After a long pause, she asked me to hold while she consulted with her supervisor. When she returned, her voice carried a carefully professional quality that suggested she'd been coached on how to handle this particular type of inquiry. She explained that the park occasionally received reports of unauthorized individuals interacting with guests, and that all such incidents were taken seriously and thoroughly investigated. She recommended that I file a formal report with park security, providing as many details as possible about the date, time, and location of the encounter. The conversation ended with her assuring me that appropriate measures would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. But I never filed that report, because somewhere deep in my mind, I'd begun to suspect that the instructor hadn't been unauthorized at all. Instead, I feared he represented something far more organized and purposeful, a presence that operated according to rules I couldn't begin to understand, recruiting students for lessons that had nothing to do with animal behavior, and everything to do with transforming observers into something else entirely. The last piece of evidence came 6 months later, when I discovered that my brother had been accepted into a specialized zoology program at a university I'd never heard him apply to. The acceptance letter arrived without any record of his having submitted an application, and when I called the admissions office to inquire about their selection process, they seemed genuinely confused by my questions. They insisted he'd been personally recommended by a faculty member whose name didn't appear in any of their current directories. The program focused exclusively on predatory behavior studies, with particular emphasis on aerial hunting strategies and territorial dominance patterns. Classes were scheduled primarily during pre-dawn hours, when most students would be sleeping and the campus would be largely empty. The letter mentioned that students would be working directly with specialized equipment and receiving individual mentorship from experts whose research had been conducted in environments most people would find inaccessible. As I write this, my brother has been enrolled in that program for 3 weeks. His phone calls home have become increasingly infrequent, and when he does contact us, his voice carries that same measured cadence I remember from the instructor at Animal Kingdom. He speaks about his studies with intense enthusiasm, describing observation techniques and hunting methodologies that sound more like military training than academic research. Yesterday, I received a postcard from him, an aerial photograph of the university campus taken from an impossible height, showing details that could only be captured by someone hovering directly above the buildings. On the back, he'd written a single sentence: "The view from up here helps you understand everything differently." I've been staring at that postcard for hours, trying to understand what kind of equipment could have captured such an image, or what kind of student would have access to it. But the longer I look, the more convinced I become that no equipment was involved at all, that the photograph was taken by someone who had learned to see the world from a predator's perspective, someone who had finally mastered the lessons that began during a rainstorm at a theme park where birds of prey were no longer supposed to be studied. Tonight, I'm going to lock all the windows in my house and try not to think about the instructor's cold, dry hand, or the way rain refused to touch him. I'm going to try not to wonder whether my brother is still my brother, or whether he's become something else entirely, something that understands hunting in ways that would terrify anyone who still thinks of themselves as prey. But mostly, I'm going to try not to look up at the sky, because I have the growing suspicion that if I do, I'll see eyes looking back. Patient, intelligent eyes that recognize me as a student who failed to attend his lessons and who might still be convinced to enroll. Story 11. The first golden slip appeared on a Tuesday morning, crisp against the dew-soaked hood of my Honda Civic. Paper thin as butterfly wings, it caught the early sunlight and seemed to glow from within. Written in elegant script were just 4 numbers: 27. 3. I stood there in my driveway, coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at those digits. The paper felt expensive between my fingers, not the cheap stuff you'd find at any office supply store. This was the kind of stationery that whispered money, the kind you'd use for wedding invitations or formal announcements. But what kind of announcement was this? 27.3 miles. Oddly specific. The rational part of my mind, the part that had gotten me through college, and into my mundane job as a cashier at Neptune's Kingdom water park, suggested it was probably some kid's prank. Maybe someone had dropped it walking by. Maybe the wind had carried it from a nearby house. These things happened in suburban neighborhoods where excitement peaked at the annual block party. But as I drove to work that morning, taking my usual route through downtown and onto the interstate, something nagged at me. When I pulled into the employee parking lot at Neptune's Kingdom, I glanced at my odometer out of habit. The trip had been exactly 3 miles. The sensation that crawled up my spine wasn't quite fear, not yet. It was more like the feeling you get when you hear your name called in a crowded room. That moment of heightened awareness before you realize it was meant for someone else. I told myself it was coincidence. People drove roughly the same distances to work every day. Someone could have made an educated guess. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than usual as I walked across the parking lot. The morning air carried the chlorine-heavy scent of the pools and the distant screams of early visitors on the water slides. Everything appeared normal. Families with oversized beach bags, teenagers cluster in loud groups, the maintenance crew hosing down the walkways. Yet something felt off, like a photograph where all the elements are correct, but the lighting is wrong. The day proceeded as most did at Neptune's Kingdom. I scanned tickets, counted change, and dealt with the occasional complaint about pricing or policies. It was during the afternoon rush that the incident occurred, the one that would make the golden notes something more than a curious mystery. A man approached my booth around 3 o'clock, middle-aged with graying temples, and an expensive watch that caught the light as he handed me a season pass. The laminated card looked legitimate enough at first glance, but years of handling these passes had given me an eye for details. The holographic seal was slightly off-center, and the photo seemed to be adhered with ordinary glue rather than the heat-sealed process the park used. I held the pass up to the light, noting the subtle imperfections that marked it as a forgery. When I looked back at the man, his expression had changed. The casual smile had vanished, replaced by something harder, more focused. I informed him that I couldn't accept the pass, explaining the policy for counterfeit tickets as diplomatically as possible. He listened without speaking, his pale eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he leaned closer to the booth window. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but the words themselves made my stomach clench. He told me he'd remember me, that we'd meet again somewhere more private, somewhere without security cameras and crowds of witnesses, a dark street perhaps, somewhere we could have a proper conversation about respect and minding one's own business. Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd as easily as he'd emerged from it. I should have reported the threat to security, but something held me back. Maybe it was the casual way he'd delivered it, as if he were commenting on the weather. Maybe it was the absolute certainty in his voice that suggested this wasn't an empty threat but a simple statement of fact. Or maybe it was the way other people in line had somehow managed not to hear our exchange, despite standing only feet away. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of routine transactions, but I found myself scanning the crowds, looking for that familiar silhouette. Every middle-aged man with gray temples made my pulse quicken. Every glimpse of reflected light off a watch face had me turning my head. That evening, I drove home through the familiar streets, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The radio played classic rock, the air conditioning hummed, and traffic moved at its usual pace. Everything was perfectly normal until I turned into my driveway and saw the second golden note. This one read 31. 8. My hands shook as I picked it up. The paper was identical to the first, that same expensive texture, the same elegant handwriting. But this number was impossible. I hadn't driven anywhere yet. I hadn't even planned my route for the next day. How could anyone know how far I would travel? I stood in my driveway as shadows lengthened around me, trying to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. Maybe someone was tracking my car. Maybe there was a GPS device hidden somewhere, and they were calculating my future routes based on past patterns. But even that explanation felt thin. My driving habits weren't that predictable. Some days I took the interstate. Other days I preferred the scenic route through the residential areas. Sometimes I stopped for gas or groceries, adding unpredictable mileage to my day. That night, I searched every inch of my car with a flashlight, looking for tracking devices or any sign of tampering. I found nothing. The Honda sat in my garage, as mundane and familiar as ever, offering no clues about the golden mystery accumulating on its hood. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of being followed down endless highways while unseen eyes tracked my every movement. I woke several times, convinced I'd heard footsteps in my driveway, or the soft rustle of paper being placed on metal. But each time I looked out the window, I saw only the familiar suburban landscape bathed in streetlight. Morning brought the third note, 19. 2. I held it up to the window, studying the paper in the harsh daylight. The texture was definitely expensive, maybe handmade. The ink had a slight shimmer to it, as if it contained metallic particles. But it was the precision of the numbers that truly unsettled me. Not rounded figures like 19 or 20, but exact measurements down to the tenth of a mile. I decided to test the prediction. Instead of driving directly to work, I planned a deliberately circuitous route. I would stop at the bank, then the grocery store, then take the long way through the industrial district. Anything to throw off whatever system was predicting my movements. The bank visit went smoothly, a quick stop to make a deposit. But as I was leaving, I noticed a gray sedan parked across the street. Nothing unusual about it, except that I was almost certain I'd seen the same car in my rearview mirror on the drive over. When I pulled out of the parking lot, it remained stationary. Coincidence, probably. At the grocery store, I bought items I didn't need, taking my time in each aisle. Milk I wouldn't drink, bread I didn't want, anything to extend the trip and add unpredictable distance. But as I loaded my bags into the car, I caught a glimpse of gray metal at the edge of my peripheral vision. The sedan was parked 4 spaces away. The drive through the industrial district should have been peaceful. Wide streets, minimal traffic, plenty of space to think. Instead, I found myself checking my mirrors obsessively. The gray sedan stayed 3 cars back, never closer, never farther. When I turned, it turned. When I stopped at lights, it stopped. But whenever I tried to get a clear look at the driver, the sun would hit the windshield just right, or a passing truck would block my view. By the time I reached Neptune's kingdom, my hands were cramped from gripping the steering wheel. I sat in the parking lot for several minutes, watching the entrance in my rearview mirror. The gray sedan never appeared. My odometer read 19. 2 miles. The impossibility of it hit me like cold water. I had deliberately taken an unpredictable route, making random stops and unnecessary detours. There was no way anyone could have known exactly how far I would drive. Yet somehow, someone had calculated it perfectly and left the number on my car 12 hours before I'd traveled the distance. The day at work passed in a haze of mounting paranoia. Every customer seemed to study my face too intently. Every casual question about my schedule or my car felt loaded with hidden meaning. When my supervisor asked if I was feeling well, I realized I'd been unconsciously scanning the crowd for gray-haired men with expensive watches. During my lunch break, I called my insurance company to report a possible theft attempt. The representative was helpful, but couldn't find any claims or reports related to my vehicle. I called the police non-emergency line to report suspicious activity, but found myself unable to explain the situation in a way that didn't sound delusional. How do you tell someone that mysterious notes are accurately predicting your future mileage? The afternoon dragged on with tropical heat and the constant sound of splashing water. Families enjoyed their day at the park, while I sat in my air-conditioned booth, jumping at every unexpected sound. When closing time finally arrived, I lingered in the employee lounge longer than necessary, reluctant to face whatever might be waiting on my car. The parking lot was nearly empty when I finally ventured out. Sodium lights cast harsh pools of yellow illumination across the asphalt, creating deep shadows between the scattered vehicles. My Honda sat alone at the far end, exactly where I'd left it, but even from a distance I could see the golden glint on the hood. Note number 4 read, 0, 0, 0 miles. Tomorrow, according to the prediction, I wouldn't drive anywhere at all. The implications of that number followed me home like a physical presence. If the pattern held true, if the notes continued to be accurate, then something would prevent me from driving tomorrow. An illness, perhaps. Car trouble, or something worse. I parked in my garage and lowered the door, listening to the mechanical grind of the opener as it sealed me inside. The familiar space felt different now, less like shelter and more like a trap. Tools hung on pegboards, oil stains marked the concrete floor, and everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. But the normalcy felt staged, as if someone had carefully arranged the scene to look undisturbed. That night, I researched everything I could find about surveillance techniques and tracking devices. The internet offered dozens of explanations for how someone might monitor another person's movements, but none that could account for predicting future behavior with such precision. GPS tracking required the target to have already traveled the route. Behavioral analysis could suggest patterns but not exact mileage. Even the most sophisticated surveillance couldn't predict random decisions made hours in advance. Unless, of course, the decisions weren't random at all. Unless I was being manipulated rather than merely observed. The thought lodged in my mind like a splinter. What if my routes weren't as unpredictable as I believed? What if subtle influences were guiding my choices, pushing me toward predetermined destinations? A road closure that forced me onto a specific highway. A traffic jam that made one route more attractive than another. Construction signs that weren't quite where they belonged. I spent hours poring over maps of my city, trying to identify choke points where traffic could be easily controlled. It was possible, theoretically. With enough resources and planning, someone could manipulate traffic patterns to force specific routing choices. But the level of coordination required would be enormous. Dozens of people, carefully timed actions, massive expense. Who would go to such lengths? And why? Sleep was impossible. Every small sound made me freeze, listening for footsteps or the soft placement of paper on metal. Twice I crept to the window to check my driveway, but saw only empty concrete and the neighbor's cat prowling through the shadows. Still, the sensation of being watched pressed against me like humid air. Morning came gray and overcast, with heavy clouds that promised rain. I dressed slowly, deliberately, trying to decide what to do. The note had predicted 0 miles of driving. If the pattern held true, something would prevent me from leaving home. But what if I defied the prediction? What if I got in my car and drove anyway? The thought of challenging whatever force was behind the notes both terrified and compelled me. I had spent 3 days as a passive observer of my own life, watching as impossible predictions came true with mechanical precision. Maybe it was time to take control back. I walked to my garage and raised the door, letting gray morning light spill across the concrete floor. My Honda sat waiting, keys dangling from my hand. But as I approached the driver's side, I noticed something that made my breath catch. The front tire was flat. Not just low, completely deflated, the rubber sagging against the rim. I walked around the car, checking the other tires. All fine. Just the front driver's side. Exactly the kind of random failure that would strand me at home for the day. I knelt beside the tire, running my hands over the rubber, looking for the cause. No obvious puncture marks, no sign of deliberate damage, just a tire that had inexplicably lost all its air during the night. As I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Across the street, partially hidden behind a telephone pole, a figure stood watching. Middle-aged gray hair, expensive watch catching the dull morning light. When I turned to look directly, he was gone. I called in sick to work, citing car trouble, which was technically true. The mechanic who came to replace my tire found nothing wrong with the old one. No puncture, no valve failure, no obvious cause for the deflation. These things happened sometimes, he told me with a shrug. Rubber was unpredictable. That evening, I didn't find a golden note on my car. Instead, I found something else entirely. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a business card, cream-colored and expensive-looking. No company name, no address, just a phone number in the same elegant script as the notes, and below it, a single line of text. "We should talk." I stood in my driveway holding the card, aware that I had reached some kind of crossroads. For 3 days, I had been a passive participant in an impossible game. Someone was demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't possess, control they shouldn't have. The rational explanation was that I was losing my mind, that stress and paranoia had finally fractured my grip on reality. The alternative was that something genuinely supernatural was occurring, that the normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied to my life. Either way, I was tired of being afraid. I dialed the number. It rang once before connecting, though no one spoke. I could hear breathing on the other end, patient and measured. Finally, I broke the silence, asking who I was speaking to. The voice that answered was familiar, the same quiet, conversational tone from the man at the water park. He thanked me for calling, as if I'd had any real choice in the matter. Then he explained, in that same maddeningly calm voice, that we needed to meet. The location he specified was a parking garage downtown, level 3, northwest corner. Midnight. Come alone, naturally. No police, no friends, no recording devices. Just a conversation between two people who had business to settle. I wanted to hang up, to delete the number and pretend none of this had happened. But I knew it wouldn't end there. The notes would continue. The predictions would keep coming true, and my life would gradually narrow until I had no choices left at all. Whatever was happening to me, whatever game I'd been drawn into, the only way out was through. Midnight found me standing in a concrete tomb of empty parking spaces, fluorescent lights humming overhead like trapped insects. The air smelled of motor oil and urban decay, and every small sound echoed off the walls with amplified intensity. I was 15 minutes early, but I wasn't alone. He emerged from behind a support pillar, as if he'd been waiting there for hours, hands clasped behind his back, that expensive watch glinting under the harsh lighting. Up close, his features were sharper than I'd remembered, his pale eyes more focused. He thanked me for coming, again with that maddening politeness that made everything feel like a social visit, rather than a confrontation. I asked him how he'd done it. The notes, the predictions, the impossible accuracy. His smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. He told me I was asking the wrong question. The right question, he explained, wasn't how, but why. Why had I been chosen? Why were my movements so important? Why was someone going to such elaborate lengths to demonstrate control over my life? Then he told me something that made the parking garage spin around me like a carousel. The forgery I'd confiscated at the water park wasn't random. It wasn't even a real attempt to gain entry. It had been placed in that line specifically for me to find. A test to see how I would react to authority and confrontation. Everything that had happened since, the notes, the predictions, the surveillance, was part of an evaluation, a job interview, if you will, though not for any position I would recognize. He told me there were people who existed in the spaces between normal society, who specialized in knowing things they shouldn't know and being places they shouldn't be. People who could predict behavior because they understood the subtle pressures that shaped decision-making. People who could appear and disappear because they knew exactly where others would be looking. They had been watching me for months, he said. My reliability, my attention to detail, my ability to spot deception. Most importantly, my capacity to adapt when reality became flexible. The offer he made was simple. Join them, learn their methods, become part of something larger than my mundane existence at Neptune's kingdom. The alternative was to continue my current life, though with the understanding that privacy was an illusion and predictability was a weakness. I asked what they wanted from me, what this organization actually did. His smile widened slightly, and for the first time, genuine amusement flickered in his pale eyes. He told me that some questions couldn't be answered until after acceptance, but that I would find the work enlightening. As I write this account, 3 days have passed since that midnight meeting. I haven't returned to work at Neptune's kingdom. I haven't called to explain my absence. Every morning I wake up expecting to find another golden note, another impossible prediction, but my car hood remains empty. Instead, I've been receiving different kinds of messages. Instructions, really. Simple tasks that seem random but probably aren't. Observe a specific street corner at a specific time. Count the number of blue cars in a certain parking lot. Note which direction people turn when they exit a particular building. Each task is easy to complete, but the underlying purpose remains opaque. I am being trained, I think, though for what remains unclear. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other people performing similar observations. A woman reading a newspaper while watching pedestrian traffic. A man feeding pigeons while noting license plate numbers. We never acknowledge each other, but there's a quality of focused attention that marks us as part of the same unseen organization. The rational part of my mind insists, this is all elaborate delusion, that I've constructed an entire conspiracy to explain away a mundane mental breakdown. But rationality feels less important now than it used to. Reality has become more flexible, more open to interpretation. Yesterday I received a package with no return address. Inside was a golden pen and a stack of expensive paper, the same kind used for the notes. At the bottom of the package was a single sheet with an address and a number. 43. 7. Tomorrow, I think, I'll be leaving my first prediction for someone else to find. Someone who works as a cashier, perhaps, or who prides themselves on following rules and spotting deception. Someone who believes the world operates according to logical principles and predictable patterns. Someone who's about to learn that reality is far more interesting than they ever imagined. The question that haunts me now isn't whether I'm losing my mind or being recruited into something genuine. The question is whether there's any meaningful difference between the two possibilities. In a world where impossible predictions come true and surveillance indistinguishable from omniscience, sanity itself becomes a relative concept. Tonight, I'll drive exactly 43, 7 miles through the city, taking a route that will seem random but isn't. Somewhere along that journey, I'll place a golden note on the hood of a carefully selected car. The number will be precise, impossible, and absolutely accurate. And tomorrow morning, someone else will stand in their driveway, holding a slip of expensive paper, wondering how anyone could possibly know something they haven't even decided yet. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. The only difference is that now I'm on the other side of the mystery, leaving questions instead of finding them. Though sometimes late at night when the rational part of my mind reasserts itself, I wonder if there is another side at all. Perhaps there are only people like me, each convinced they've graduated from victim to perpetrator, each leaving golden notes for the next person in line. An endless chain of the confused and the paranoid, each believing they've joined something real when they've only inherited someone else's delusion. But then morning comes, and I receive my instructions, and I perform my small tasks with the precision of someone who belongs to something larger than themselves. Whether that something is real or imagined has become irrelevant. After all, what difference does it make if the mystery is genuine or manufactured, as long as the predictions keep coming true? Story 12. The first call came on a Tuesday evening while I was stirring pasta sauce, the wooden spoon making lazy circles against the saucepan's bottom. The kitchen windows were fogged with steam, and outside, October rain drummed against the glass like impatient fingers. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and these days, unknown calls usually meant robotic voices promising debt consolidation or extended warranties. But something made me reach for the receiver anyway. The voice on the other end was pleasant enough, warm even, with the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to making calls for a living. He introduced himself as conducting a survey for household economics research, explaining that my number had been randomly selected from a database of homeowners in the area. Nothing unusual there. I'd received similar calls before, brief questionnaires about spending habits or consumer preferences that took 5 minutes and earned the caller a few dollars. He asked standard questions at first: my age range, household income bracket, monthly expenses. His tone remained professional throughout, occasionally making small sounds of acknowledgement as I answered. The rain continued its percussion against the windows, and I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of survey responses. Then, just as I expected him to thank me for my time, his voice changed. Not dramatically. The shift was subtle, like a minor key creeping into a major chord. He repeated a phrase, slowly and deliberately, as if reading from a script he wanted to ensure I understood perfectly. "Your next balance will be 0. Before I could ask what he meant, the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, pasta sauce bubbling forgotten on the stove, trying to process what had just happened. The phrase seemed to echo in the sudden silence of my kitchen, though that was impossible. The rain continued, the refrigerator hummed, the sauce still burbled. Yet somehow, those 4 words hung in the air with a weight that made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing. Survey companies sometimes included odd statements as part of their data collection, psychological experiments disguised as market research. Or perhaps he'd been reading from the wrong script, meant for a different type of call entirely. I turned off the burner, stirred the sauce one final time, and tried to forget about it. But the phrase lingered in my mind like an unwelcome visitor who refuses to leave. 3 days later, he called again. This time I was in my home office, reviewing quarterly reports that needed to be submitted by month's end. The same number appeared on my phone's display, and despite every rational instinct telling me to let it go to voicemail, I answered. The conversation followed an identical pattern, the same warm introduction, the same explanation about household economics research, even some of the same questions he'd asked before. When I mentioned that we'd already spoken, he paused, a silence so complete I could hear him breathing, before continuing as if I hadn't said anything at all. The questions this time focused on my financial stability, my debt-to-income ratio, my confidence in my ability to meet future obligations. His tone remained professional, but there was something underneath it now, a subtle undercurrent that made the hair on my arms stand up. I found myself answering honestly despite growing unease, as if his voice carried some compulsive quality that made lying impossible. And then, just like before, came the closing statement, "Your next balance will be 0. This time I tried to respond, to ask what company he represented, or what the phrase meant, but again the line went dead before I could form the words. I sat staring at my phone, the quarterly reports forgotten, while outside my office window the October sky seemed to darken despite the early hour. I spent the next hour researching the phone number online, searching for any connection to legitimate survey companies or market research firms. Nothing came up. The number existed in that strange digital limbo of unused lines, showing no ownership records or associated businesses. I even called it back, only to reach a recording stating that the number was not in service. Yet somehow, impossibly, calls continued to come from it. The third call arrived exactly 3 days later, at precisely the same time of evening as the first. I'd been watching for it, dreading it, yet when my phone actually rang and that familiar number appeared on the screen, my hand moved to answer it almost against my will. This conversation was different. The caller's voice retained its professional warmth, but the questions had changed, becoming more personal, more invasive. He asked about my sleep patterns, whether I'd been experiencing any unusual anxiety or stress, if I'd noticed any changes in my daily routines. It felt less like a survey and more like a psychological evaluation, as if he were assessing my mental state rather than my economic habits. When I challenged him directly, asking why he kept calling and what organization he represented, he responded with patient deflection, steering the conversation back to his questions, with the skill of someone trained in handling difficult subjects. His persistence was unsettling, but more disturbing was my inability to simply hang up. Something about his voice seemed to bypass my conscious defenses, making resistance feel both urgent and impossible. The call lasted longer this time, nearly 20 minutes of increasingly uncomfortable questions about my relationship with money, my fears about financial security, my deepest anxieties about the future. By the end, I felt emotionally drained, as if he'd somehow reached through the phone line and examined the contents of my mind. Then came the closing phrase, delivered with the same measured cadence as before. "Your next balance will be 0. But this time, something was different. This time, I could swear I heard an echo. Not through the phone. The line had already gone dead. The echo seemed to come from inside my house, as if the words had somehow been spoken in multiple rooms simultaneously. I stood up from my desk, heart hammering, and walked through each room, checking corners and closets, looking for what? A hidden speaker? An intruder who'd somehow gained access to repeat the caller's words? I found nothing, of course, but the sensation lingered, the certainty that those words had been spoken not just to me, but around me, as if my house itself had become complicit in whatever was happening. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Every 3 days at the same time, the call would come. The questions grew more invasive, more personal, probing into areas of my life I'd never discussed with anyone. The caller seemed to know things about me, small details about my habits, my fears, my history, that I was certain I'd never shared with him. More disturbing still was my growing inability to resist the calls. I'd see that number on my phone and feel my hand moving to answer it despite every conscious intention to let it ring. It was as if my body had developed its own relationship with the caller, independent of my will. Each conversation ended the same way. Your next balance will be 0. And each time, that impossible echo seemed to grow stronger, more distinct, until I began to suspect the words weren't just being repeated. They were being amplified, spread throughout my house by some mechanism I couldn't understand. I started making notes after each call, trying to track patterns or extract meaning from the questions. But when I'd review my notes the next day, they seemed to change. Words I was certain I'd written appeared different. Sentences I remembered recording were nowhere to be found. It was as if the very act of documenting these conversations somehow altered the documentation itself. Sleep became difficult. I'd lie awake listening for sounds that weren't there, feeling watched by eyes I couldn't locate. The house seemed different somehow, not physically, but atmospherically, as if the very air had become dense with expectation. Shadows fell at wrong angles. Familiar objects appeared slightly displaced, and the silence between the caller's words seemed to seep into the spaces between my own thoughts. 3 weeks into this routine, I noticed the first clock. It was the antique mantel clock in my living room, a wedding gift from my grandmother that had kept perfect time for nearly a decade. I noticed it during breakfast, glancing up from my coffee to check the time and seeing something that made my spoon freeze halfway to my mouth. Both hands pointed straight down. Not to 6 o'clock. That would have been explainable. A simple coincidence of timing. No, both hands pointed to the bottom of the clock face, perpendicular to the floor, as if gravity had somehow claimed them both simultaneously. I approached the clock slowly, studying its face with growing unease. The hands weren't just pointing down. They appeared to be weighted there, pulled by some force stronger than the mechanism's normal operation. When I touched the minute hand, trying to move it, it resisted with surprising strength before snapping back to its downward position the moment I released it. The clock still ticked. I could hear its familiar rhythm, see the second hand continuing its steady circuit, but the hour and minute hands remained frozen in their strange, debt-like position. I told myself it was a mechanical failure, nothing more. Old clocks sometimes developed quirks, required maintenance or replacement parts. But as the day progressed, I discovered it wasn't just the mantel clock. The kitchen clock showed the same configuration, both hands pointing straight down despite its digital display showing the correct time. The alarm clock beside my bed, the decorative timepiece in my bathroom, even my wristwatch when I checked it that evening, all showed their hands frozen in that same downward position, as if every timekeeping device in my house had simultaneously decided to mark not time, but debt. That night, the caller's voice seemed different, still professional, still warm, but underneath I detected something new. Satisfaction, perhaps, or anticipation. His questions had evolved again, focusing now on my perception of time, my relationship with schedules and deadlines, whether I'd noticed any unusual patterns in my daily routine. When I mentioned the clocks, a slip I immediately regretted. He paused for so long I thought the call had disconnected. Then he resumed, as if I'd said nothing. but I could hear something in his breathing now, a rhythm that matched the ticking of my frozen timepieces. "Your next balance will be 0, he said at the call's end, and this time the echo was unmistakable. The words came from every clock in my house simultaneously, spoken in perfect unison with voices that sounded exactly like mine. I ran through my house that night, yanking batteries from clocks, unplugging digital displays, stopping every timepiece I could find. But even silenced, their hands remained frozen in that damning position, pointing downward like accusatory fingers marking debts I'd never incurred. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my darkened bedroom, listening to a silence that seemed pregnant with ticking sounds that were no longer there. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if something vast and patient were pressing down on my house from above. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every creak and settle of the old building's bones sounded like footsteps in rooms I knew were empty. Morning brought no relief. If anything, the wrongness seemed more pronounced in daylight, as if the sun's rays couldn't quite penetrate whatever had settled over my home. I called in sick to work, unable to imagine sitting through meetings and presentations while my house waited for me like a patient predator. The phone calls continued, every 3 days like clockwork, though what meaning did clockwork have now, when time itself had become corrupted? The caller's questions grew more abstract, more philosophical. He asked about my understanding of debt, not just financial, but existential. Whether I believed in balance, cosmic justice, the settling of accounts that transcended simple monetary exchange. I found myself answering honestly despite my terror, as if his voice had become a confessional booth where resistance was impossible. He seemed to know about the clocks, though I'd mentioned them only once. His questions probed at the edges of my sanity, suggesting explanations that made no rational sense yet felt disturbingly plausible. Was it possible, he asked, that some debts existed outside normal accounting systems? That balance could be demanded in currencies more fundamental than money? That time itself might serve as collateral in transactions we weren't consciously aware of making? By the end of each call, I felt as if I'd been turned inside out, examined and found wanting by some authority I couldn't name or understand. And always, always, came that final phrase, "Your next balance will be 0. The echo had evolved into something more complex now. The words didn't just come from my silenced clocks. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, the foundation, the very bones of my house, as if the structure had learned to speak in my voice, repeating the caller's promise like a mantra or a curse. A week before month's end, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. I would not answer the next call. When the phone rang at the appointed time, I sat in my kitchen and watched its display, hands clenched into fists, as that familiar number appeared on the screen. The ringing seemed louder than usual, more insistent, but I forced myself to remain still. After 6 rings, it stopped. The silence that followed was profound, not just quiet, but actively empty, as if sound itself had been drained from my house. I sat in that void for several minutes, feeling proud of my resistance, until I realized I could hear something else. Breathing. Not my own. Though I was breathing too, shallow and quick with residual fear. This was deeper, more measured, the rhythm of someone completely at ease. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if my house had developed lungs and learned to use them. Then came the voice, speaking not through my phone but through the air itself, filling every room simultaneously with those familiar warm tones. Your next balance will be 0. But this time the words didn't stop. They repeated, overlapping, building into a chorus of my own voice speaking the caller's message. The sound grew louder, more complex, until it seemed every surface in my house had become a speaker, broadcasting that single, damning phrase. I ran outside, bursting through my front door into the October night, and found blessed silence. Street lamps glowed reassuringly. Normal sounds of traffic and distant televisions provided familiar comfort. My house stood behind me, looking perfectly ordinary from the outside, giving no indication of the acoustic nightmare contained within. But when I checked my phone, I had 17 missed calls from that same impossible number. I spent the night in my car, parked on a residential street several blocks away, trying to understand what was happening to me. Was this some elaborate prank? A sophisticated form of harassment? Had I somehow become the target of technology I didn't understand, speakers hidden in my walls and synchronized to torment me? Or was I losing my mind? The question seemed more urgent than terrifying. Mental illness would be explicable, treatable, fundamentally normal compared to the alternatives my imagination was suggesting. Psychotic breaks happen to real people for understandable reasons. Stress, chemical imbalances, underlying conditions that could be diagnosed and managed. But as I sat in my car, watching my house through the rearview mirror, I saw something that made rational explanations suddenly seem inadequate. Every window in my house was glowing, not with electric light, but with something deeper, more organic. The glow pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like a massive heartbeat. And though I was too far away to hear anything, I could see the shadows of clock hands moving behind those windows, sweeping in perfect synchronization toward that familiar downward position. The final call came on Halloween night, though I wasn't there to answer it. I'd been staying in a motel for 3 days, trying to work up the courage to return home. When I finally did, drawn by responsibilities I couldn't abandon indefinitely, I found my house exactly as I'd left it, except for the 17 messages on my answering machine. Each message was identical. My own voice, speaking with mechanical precision, repeating the caller's phrase exactly 17 times before the recording ended. But these weren't echoes or replications. They were something else. As if the house itself had learned to make phone calls. The final message was different. It was the caller's voice, warm and professional as always, but speaking words I'd never heard before. The balance has been calculated. Payment is due. Thank you for your participation in our household economics survey. Every clock in my house now showed the same time, both hands pointing straight down, frozen in permanent debt. They would never move again, I somehow knew, because time itself had been paid as collateral for a transaction I'd never agreed to make. As I write this, sitting in my kitchen while shadows gather outside my windows, I can hear breathing in the walls. Patient, measured, satisfied breathing. The caller got what he wanted, though I still don't understand what that was. My financial accounts remain unchanged, my actual debts no different than before. But time moves differently now. Minutes feel longer, hours seem to skip, and days blend into each other as if some fundamental rhythm has been disrupted. The clocks still tick. I can hear them in the silence between heartbeats. But their hands will never move again. And sometimes, late at night, when the house settles around me like a living thing, I hear my own voice speaking from empty rooms. Your next balance will be 0. I don't know if I'm crazy. I don't know if any of this really happened. But tomorrow, exactly 30 days after the first call, I'm supposed to receive my monthly bills. I wonder what balance they'll show. I wonder if I'll be able to read them at all, or if time has finally stopped working the way it should. The breathing in the walls is getting louder. Story 13. The fluorescent lights hummed with that particular frequency that made my teeth ache. I should have known better than to work out this late, but the resort's 24-hour gym had seemed like the perfect solution to my insomnia. The place felt different at 2:47 a.m. Too quiet, too sterile, like a medical facility masquerading as a fitness center. I was toweling off after my set when I noticed the badge on the reception counter. The smiling attendant who'd checked me in had vanished, probably to refill the towel dispensers or whatever these places required at ungodly hours. The plastic ID card sat there, innocuous except for the way it caught the overhead light at an odd angle, creating shadows that seemed deeper than they should be. My first instinct was to ignore it. Mind your own business, my father always said. But something about the card nagged at me. Maybe it was the way it seemed deliberately placed, or how the fluorescent buzz grew louder when I looked directly at it. I picked it up, intending to leave it somewhere more visible for when the employee returned. The photo showed a man in his 30s with pale skin and that forced smile common to corporate headshots. But it was the other details that made my stomach clench. The issue date read March 15, 1998, 27 years ago. The position title, printed in faded black text, read, Deep Sleep Instructor. I turned the card over, looking for an expiration date or some explanation, but found only a magnetic strip and a serial number that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The plastic felt warm against my fingertips, warmer than it should have been sitting under the air conditioning. A soft click echoed through the empty gym. I looked up to see the main entrance had sealed itself, the electronic lock engaging with a finality that sent ice through my veins. The red light above the door blinked once, then went dark. I tried the handle anyway, knowing it was futile. The metal was cold and unyielding. That's when I noticed the displays on the exercise equipment had changed. Every treadmill, elliptical, and stationary bike now showed the same information. A heart rate of 87 BPM, climbing steadily. My heart rate. The numbers pulsed in rhythm with the thrumming in my chest. Each digital beat synchronized with the very real pounding behind my ribs. I approached the nearest treadmill, its screen glowing with an unnatural intensity. The machine wasn't running, wasn't even plugged in. I could see the cord coiled neatly beneath it. Yet the display showed not only my heart rate, but my exact position in the room, represented by a small blinking dot on what appeared to be a floor plan. The badge in my hand grew warmer. I walked toward the weight section, and the dot moved accordingly. When I stopped by the bench press, the heart rate spiked to 94. The coincidence was impossible to ignore, even as my rational mind scrambled for explanations. Bluetooth connectivity, maybe, or some kind of biometric sensors built into the floor. Resorts spent fortunes on technology these days, but that didn't explain the date on the badge, or why every machine in the place was monitoring me without any visible sensors. The air conditioning shut off with a mechanical sigh, leaving the gym in perfect silence except for the persistent hum of the lights and the soft electronic beeping of the heart rate monitors. In that quiet, I became aware of another sound, a rhythmic whisper that might have been breathing, if breathing could come from the walls themselves. I held up the badge again, studying the photo more carefully. The man's smile seemed different now, less forced and more knowing, as if he could see me through the plastic. His eyes, which I'd initially thought were gray, appeared darker, almost black in the shifting fluorescent light. The temperature was dropping. I could see my breath forming small clouds in the artificial chill, and the metal equipment felt like ice when I accidentally brushed against a barbell. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked pale and distorted, as if the glass itself was warping my image. On every screen throughout the gym, my heart rate had climbed to 101. I tried my phone, but the device showed no signal bars despite the fact that I'd had full coverage just minutes earlier. The Wi-Fi networks that had been available when I checked in were gone too, replaced by a single option. Deep Sleep Protocol 1998. The network was password protected. Moving through the gym felt like swimming through thick air. Each step required more effort than it should have, and my movement seemed to lag behind my intentions by fractions of seconds. The mirrors reflected my actions with a delay that made me dizzy, as if I was watching a recording of myself rather than a real-time reflection. The badge was becoming uncomfortably hot now, but I couldn't seem to let go of it. My fingers felt fused to the plastic, and when I tried to drop it, my hand simply refused to obey. The heat spread up my arm like an infection. Not painful exactly, but wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. I noticed the exercise bikes had begun to move on their own, pedals rotating in slow, deliberate circles despite being unoccupied. The treadmill belts started their leisurely crawl, all at exactly the same speed, the pace of a relaxed walk, or perhaps the rhythm of deep, steady breathing. The heart rate monitors showed 108 now. In the far corner of the gym, near the stretching mats, I spotted a door I hadn't noticed before. It was painted the same institutional white as the walls, nearly invisible except for a small placard that read "Staff Only" in the same font as the badge. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. As I approached, the whisper breathing sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the walls after all, but from the crack beneath that door. The sound of many people sleeping deeply, their exhalations synchronized in an almost musical pattern. The badge in my hand pulsed with heat in time with the breathing. I should have turned around. Every instinct screamed at me to find another exit, to break a window if necessary, to get out of this place that felt less like a gym and more like a laboratory with each passing moment. Instead, I found myself moving toward that door, drawn by a curiosity that felt both alien and irresistible. My reflection in the nearby mirror showed someone I barely recognized, eyes too wide, skin too pale, holding a badge that seemed to glow with its own inner light. But worse than that was what the mirror revealed behind me, shadows that moved independently of any light source, taking shapes that suggested human forms before dissolving back into darkness. The heart rate on every machine had reached 115. The door swung open at my touch, revealing a corridor that shouldn't have existed. The gym was on the ground floor of the resort, with nothing but parking lot beyond its walls. Yet this hallway stretched into the distance, lit by the same fluorescent bulbs that hummed with increasing intensity. Along the walls were photographs, dozens of them, showing smiling guests in what appeared to be the same gym. But the photos were old. The clothing styles, the hairstyles, even the quality of the images suggested they were taken years or even decades ago. And in every single photograph, partially visible in the background, was the same pale man from the badge. The deep breathing sound was coming from rooms along the corridor, each door marked with a year, 1998, 1999, 2000, and so on, continuing into the distance. Through the small windows in each door, I could see the silhouettes of people lying on what looked like hospital beds, their chests rising and falling in perfect unison. My heart rate hit 122, and the badge began to vibrate in my palm. I wanted to run, but my legs carried me forward down the corridor, past door after door of sleeping forms. The air grew thicker with each step, filled with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something organic and sweet, like flowers left too long in water. The last door was different. Instead of a year, it bore my name in the same faded lettering as the job title on the badge. Through its window, I could see a bed prepared with fresh white sheets, a small table beside it holding what appeared to be monitoring equipment, and a chart hanging at the foot that I couldn't quite read from this angle. That's when I understood. The resort's 24-hour gym wasn't for exercise. It was a recruitment center, a way to identify guests who suffered from insomnia, who wandered the halls in the small hours when sleep eluded them. The badge wasn't lost. It was left for me to find, a key to bring me here to this corridor, to this room with my name on it. The deep sleep instructor wasn't a person. It was a program, a process, something that had been operating for decades beneath the veneer of a luxury resort. And I had volunteered myself by picking up that badge, by staying after hours, by being exactly the kind of person they were looking for. My heart rate on the distant monitors had stabilized at 130, but I could feel it slowing as the corridor's atmosphere worked on me. The breathing sounds had become hypnotic, lulling, and I found my eyelids growing heavy despite my terror. The badge in my hand was no longer hot. It was cool and comfortable, like a worry stone worn smooth by countless fingers. As I looked at it one final time, the photo seemed to smile wider, and for just a moment, I could swear the man winked. The door to my room opened on its own. Inside, the bed looked impossibly comfortable, the sheets crisp and inviting after my workout and the strange journey through the gym. The monitoring equipment hummed quietly, and I could see my name already printed on the chart. Patient intake, scheduled for long-term deep sleep therapy, indefinite duration. I took a step inside, then another. The badge fell from my fingers and clattered to the floor, its purpose fulfilled. Behind me, I could hear the door to the gym corridor closing with a soft pneumatic hiss, sealing off my retreat. But retreat seemed less important now than it had moments before. The bed was so close, and I was suddenly, overwhelmingly tired, more tired than I'd been in years. The insomnia that had driven me to the gym seemed like a distant memory, as my eyes grew heavy, and my breathing began to synchronize with the gentle rhythm coming from the other rooms. As I sat on the edge of the bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror mounted on the opposite wall. My reflection showed someone peaceful, relaxed, ready for the deepest sleep of his life. But in the glass, I could also see the corridor beyond the door, and all those other rooms with their quietly breathing occupants. The monitoring equipment beside my bed flickered to life, displaying vital signs that weren't quite mine. Or perhaps they were, just adjusted for optimal sleeping conditions. The numbers scrolled steadily downward as my consciousness began to fade. In my last moment of awareness, I wondered how long I'd been planning to stay at the resort. A week? 2 weeks? It didn't matter now. I had found what I came looking for, a cure for insomnia, a solution to the sleepless nights that had plagued me for so long. The deep sleep instructor program was exactly what I needed. As darkness claimed me, I could hear new sounds from the gym beyond, the soft click of the entrance door unlocking, footsteps on the polished floor, and a voice calling out to ask if anyone was still there. Someone else with insomnia, someone else wandering the resort in the small hours, drawn to the 24-hour gym and whatever relief it might offer. On the reception counter, I knew another badge would be waiting. The heart rate monitors in the gym would soon display a new set of numbers, tracking a new participant in the program. And in the corridor of doors, somewhere past my room, another door would bear another name, waiting for another insomniac to find their way to the deepest sleep of their life. I tried to form one last coherent thought about whether this was real or just the elaborate dream of an exhausted mind, but the distinction no longer seemed important. Real or imagined, the Deep Sleep Instructor program was thorough, professional, and exactly what its clients needed, even if they never woke up to realize it.